The man known to history as George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 at his father's plantation of Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County in the colony of Virginia, one of the 13 British colonies in North America. His father was Augustine Washington, a member of Virginia's landed gentry and a successful businessman who owned several tobacco plantations as well as iron operations in Virginia and neighboring Maryland, in partnership with the English Principio Company. He was also active in the local militia and was a justice of the peace and sheriff for Westmoreland County. Augustine had married his first wife, Jane Butler, in 1715, who bore him 4 children before her death in 1729. A couple of years later, in 1731, he would marry the 23-year-old Mary Johnson Ball, who would give him a further 6 children, of whom George was the eldest. Mary Washington was born in 1708 to an elderly father who died 3 years later, leaving her 400 acres of land, while her mother died when she was 12. The orphaned Mary was left in the care of family friend George Eskridge, who was probably responsible for introducing her to Augustine Washington. Thus, when Mary gave birth to her first son, she named him George. Brought up as a loyal subject of the British Empire, as a child, George Washington could never imagine that one day he would be responsible for leading the successful military rebellion to break free from Britain and establish the United States of America. He grew up in eastern Virginia amidst a vast expanse of farmland with plantation houses and small towns dotted across the landscape. Within the British social hierarchy, the Washingtons were considered commoners, far removed from the regal splendor of the court of King George II. Nevertheless, within the American colonies, the Washingtons were by no means poor, and with over 10,000 acres of plantation land, together with his other commercial interests, Augustine Washington was certainly a member of the local elite. His wealth and prosperity depended in part on slave labor, allowing plantation owners a lot of free time, which was typically filled with fox hunts, horse races, and other entertainments. Augustine Washington's tendency to move around his properties to better manage his business interests meant that George had an unsettled childhood. In 1735, the family moved to the 2,500-acre estate of Little Hunting Creek on the banks of the Potomac River, and 3 years later, in 1738, they moved once again to Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River across from the port of Fredericksburg and a short ride away from the ironworks at Accokeek Creek. From his house, George could see the ships being loaded with tobacco, iron, and other commodities, which would soon fuel the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and in return, the colony of Virginia grew steadily richer. One of the most important figures in George's childhood was his half-brother Lawrence. 14 years older than George, Lawrence studied at Appleby Grammar School, where he stayed on as a teacher until the age of 20. It was around this time, when George was 6 years old, that the two brothers first met. He heard stories of Lawrence's service as a captain in a Virginia company in 1739 during the War of Jenkins' Ear against Spain, named after the British naval captain whose ear had been cut off during an altercation with the Spanish several years earlier. Lawrence was part of an expeditionary force led by Admiral Edward Vernon, which attacked the Spanish port of Cartagena in South America. The effort proved a bloody failure as the force was cut down by the enemy and yellow fever. Captain Washington never made it off the ship, blaming General Thomas Wentworth, who treated the American soldiers with disdain and did not even let them leave their ships. In spite of this, Lawrence Washington proudly served the British Army as a commissioned officer and was appointed Adjutant General of Virginia, with responsibility over the organization of the colony's militia companies. when his father transferred him to the management of the estate at Little Hunting Creek, he renamed it Mount Vernon after the admiral. George may have expected to receive the same classical education as his elder half-brothers, but such hopes were extinguished on the 12th of April 1743 when his father died at the age of 49. The 11-year-old George's share of his father's inheritance was Ferry Farm, but his mother Mary continued to run the estate and would continue to do so as George reached adulthood. Mary's strict upbringing of her 5 surviving children meant that the relationship between mother and son was cool and distant, with George addressing her in formal terms in his letters as "Honoured Madam." He looked forward to his trips to visit Lawrence at Mount Vernon as an escape from his overbearing mother. Details of George Washington's early education are sketchy, and any instruction he received was likely rather basic. The available evidence suggests that he had lessons in basic mathematics and picked up knowledge of business and economics of his own accord. As a teenager, he would read widely in history and philosophy, as well as the popular fiction of the time. He also enjoyed physical activity and outdoor pursuits, swimming in the Rappahannock, and proved to be an excellent horseback rider, an attribute that would serve him well in his military career. Later in life, Washington regretted not having the opportunity to study French, Latin, and Greek, the signs of social and intellectual distinction of the day. Among his better educated friends and colleagues such as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, who provided the theoretical and intellectual foundations of the United States of America, Washington's intellect seemed backward and provincial. In his own terms, however, he was an intelligent man who could translate ideas into action. After losing his father, Washington came to rely even more heavily on his brother Lawrence, who had not only been elected to the House of Burgesses, but had married Anne Fairfax, whose family owned more than 5 million acres, managed by her father, Colonel William Fairfax, on behalf of his English cousin, the 6th Baron Fairfax. The young George Washington befriended Anne's brother, George William Fairfax, who was 8 years his senior, and also won the affection of her father, the colonel. In 1746, the elder Fairfax and Lawrence planned to help George escape the clutches of his mother by joining the Royal Navy. Unwilling to lose a useful helping hand on the farm, Mary eventually vetoed the plan. Thwarted in his ambitions to go to sea, at the age of 15, George decided to become a surveyor, a lucrative profession as settlers continued to expand westwards. This training allowed him to appreciate geographical features on maps and in the real world, a skill which he would use throughout his professional life. His first job in the spring of 1748 was to help the Fairfaxes divide up their vast domains into plots for further development. Within a couple of years, he would make his first investments in land, buying up over 2,000 acres by the time he turned 20. George would add to his land holdings in 1752 following the death of Lawrence from tuberculosis that July at the age of 34, leaving behind his wife and a baby daughter. Lawrence stipulated that in the event of their deaths, his estate of Mount Vernon would pass on to George. The death of his brother dealt a heavy blow to George, who had hoped to emulate Lawrence's military career. After lobbying the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, he was appointed Adjutant General of his home district in February 1753 with the rank of Major. Major Washington would soon be a very busy man. By 1753, both the British and French empires owned large tracts of land in North America. The 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast, bounded by the Allegheny Mountains to the west, while the French territories ran from New Orleans in the southwest through the Mississippi to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River in the north. As both empires expanded their footprint, they soon had competing claims on the vast Ohio country. In 1752, the French began building several forts in the disputed territory, and the following year, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, a leading investor in the Ohio Company, received permission from London to build a set of British forts alongside instructions to inform the French to leave the area. The 21-year-old Washington was chosen for this special mission and set off with a small company and crossed the Alleghenies in November 1753. Washington executed his task diligently, not only carrying out his diplomatic duties, but gathering intelligence on the terrain and the strength of the French and Native American presence in the area. Upon his return to the colonial capital of Williamsburg in January 1754, his journal was adapted into a report for the council and was passed on to London, where it informed British military preparations to defend the Ohio country against the French. Washington secured for himself a major role in these military preparations, leading a small militia force who would march to the forks of the Ohio River and construct a fort. At the same time, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, though he was disappointed that as a colonial officer, his salary was much lower than those of regular officers in the British Army who had royal commissions. In early April, Washington set out with 160 men into the wilderness, only to learn that a force of 1,000 Frenchmen had captured the fort the British were building at the Forks and renamed it Fort Duquesne after the Governor-General of French Canada. Washington and his Native American allies called for reinforcements and made camp. On the 28th of May 1754, Washington and his company found a small group of French soldiers encamped in a secluded position. Believing them to be up to no good, Washington's men surrounded them, and a quick firefight resulted in a French surrender. During the skirmish, a French officer delivering a diplomatic message asking the British to evacuate the Ohio County was supposedly brutally killed by one of Washington's Native American allies. The act sparked an international incident, and while Washington was applauded in the colonies for being a hero, the authorities in London considered his behavior reckless and further evidence that colonial soldiers could not be trusted. Anticipating a French response, Washington hastily constructed a wooden fort named Fort Necessity. During these preparations, his commanding officer had died after falling off his horse, and Washington took command of the Virginia Regiment as colonel. When he disregarded his Native American allies' advice to withdraw on account of the inadequate defenses provided by the fort, they deserted him and left the British to fight alone. When the French and their Native American allies attacked on the 3rd of July, Washington put up a brave fight, but lost a third of his men and was forced to surrender. It was a humiliating defeat, and he had made many mistakes owing to his lack of experience, but he learned from it the effectiveness of the enemy's mobile tactics and the futility of defending poor positions. The defeat could have ended Washington's military career before it started, but instead, after a few weeks had passed, he and his men were praised for their brave last stand against the odds. While the Virginia Regiment was disbanded, leaving Washington without a command, his personal fortunes improved when his late brother Lawrence's daughter died at the end of December. As Anne had already remarried, Washington agreed to lease the estate of Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law and made it his main residence. Not long after he moved into Mount Vernon, Washington received news in February 1755 that General Edward Braddock had landed with 2 regiments of reinforcements from Britain. Washington rushed to offer his services, and Braddock was happy to have him as aide-de-camp. Leaving his younger brother Jack in charge of Mount Vernon, Washington joined Braddock in June, and the army made its slow progress towards Fort Duquesne. Although personally warm towards Washington, Braddock held the same disdain for colonial soldiers as many of his fellow officers in the regular army, and refused to heed his aide-de-camp's advice to travel lightly, before eventually giving in to the situation to pick up the glacial pace of the advance. On the 9th of July, Braddock approached Fort Duquesne with more than 2,000 men and divided his army into 3 columns to attack. The British were surprised by the ferocious defense of 900 French and Native Americans, whose tactics once again proved superior. Washington bravely carried out Braddock's orders to rally the troops, exposing himself to great danger with 2 horses shot from underneath him. This was not enough to bring victory, and Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Following Braddock's death, the Virginia Regiment was reformed, and Washington was appointed commander of all of Virginia's forces. Despite these rapid promotions, Washington remained unhappy about not receiving a royal commission. He resented London's strategy to pursue active operations in Canada while remaining on the defensive on the frontiers of Virginia, leaving him nothing to do but to train and drill his men. He was dismayed by the state of the militiamen under his responsibility, many of whom deserted en masse. In late 1757, he was struck down by a grave illness that prompted him to return to Mount Vernon. During this time, he would begin to make changes to the estate and create a house fit for an English country gentleman. In early 1758, after a brief courtship, he was engaged to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy 26-year-old widow whose husband had died the previous summer, leaving her with 2 young children. A warm and sociable woman, Martha was the polar opposite of her mother-in-law Mary, and proved a steadfast support in her husband's life and career, capable not only of carrying out the domestic duties of a housewife, but also of running the Mount Vernon estate in her husband's absence. In July 1758, Washington returned to action as the British made a further attempt to seize Fort Duquesne and avenge the loss of Braddock, this time serving under the Scottish General John Forbes. In the meantime, he entered political office for the first time by handsomely winning election to the Virginia House of Burgesses representing Frederick County, a reflection of his reputation as a war hero. Despite some disagreements with his superior and a devastating friendly fire incident which claimed the lives of more than 20 of his men, Washington led 2,500 men and successfully recaptured Fort Duquesne in November 1758. Instead of the ferocious defense he had met on previous occasions, he encountered no resistance at all, as the French chose to abandon and destroy the fort after falling out with their Native American allies. The British rebuilt it and named it Fort Pitt, after War Minister William Pitt, while the city that was built around it would take the name of Pittsburgh, in the state of Pennsylvania. The action would be Washington's last in the French and Indian War, better known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, where the fighting between Britain and France, supported by their respective allies, would last until 1763. Washington returned to Mount Vernon and married Martha on the 6th of January 1759, making him one of Virginia's richest landowners. In their efforts to emulate the upper class in England, importing the latest fashions from London, Washington became increasingly indebted to his London agents and resented their power over the colonial planters. At the same time, he carried out his civic duties in the House of Burgesses, serving on committees related to military matters and limiting any speeches to the most important points of the debate. For the next 2 decades of his life, Washington would devote his energies to his plantation, in particular to growing tobacco. This proved a poor economic decision, and one Washington would later regret, as the quality of the tobacco crop was highly dependent on weather conditions, while international market prices were volatile. These factors contributed to Washington's struggles repaying his debts to his creditors in London, Another key aspect of tobacco farming was its labor intensiveness and dependence on slavery. During his life, Washington owned over 600 slaves. He and his fellow planters treated slaves as any other type of property to be bought and sold, although over time he grew to despise the practice and treated his slaves more humanely than most of his peers, looking after their health and eventually refusing to sell any of his slaves in order to keep families together. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 in a decisive victory for the British in North America. France had lost Canada to Britain and Louisiana to Spain. The cost to the British Treasury had been enormous, and half the national budget went on interest repayments on government debt. In an effort to fill the hole in government coffers, Parliament attempted to impose taxes and other economic costs onto the North American colonies, preventing the existing colonies from further westward expansion. As a soldier, Washington had resented the superior attitude of the British authorities and their refusal to give him a royal commission. As a businessman, Washington now had cause to consider the decisions of the British authorities to be detrimental to his economic interests. The most infamous piece of legislation passed by Parliament was the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a tax on all printed material, including legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. Washington may not have been the most radical of the voices protesting against the Stamp Act on the political stage, but he considered the tax unconstitutional and wrote to his representatives in London that the colonies would begin to boycott British goods in favor of domestic substitutes, and courts would shut down, preventing British creditors from collecting their dues from their American debtors. At around the same time, and perhaps concerned about his dependency on British credit, Washington decided to diversify away from tobacco, eventually abandoning the crop altogether in favor of wheat, corn, hemp, and dozens of other crops. Mount Vernon also had an extensive fishing enterprise from the plentiful stocks on the Potomac, initially for consumption within the house and later salted and cured for export to international markets. The diversification away from the labor-intensive tobacco crop encouraged Washington to train his surplus slaves in a number of crafts, such as carpentry, bricklaying, smithing, and baking. Although Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it continued to assert the right to taxation in the colonies, prompting sustained opposition, which spread throughout the 13 colonies. In 1767, the Townshend Acts, named after the British Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, levied duties on paint, lead, glass, paper, and tea. During the winter of 1768 to 69, Washington's attitude became more radical, and he supported a boycott of British goods. While he did not rule out armed insurrection against what he considered a sustained attack on American liberties, he believed that non-violent economic measures should be used first. In April 1769, Washington took a more proactive role in the House of Burgesses, intending to present a plan for the importation of British goods developed alongside his friend George Mason of Fairfax County. The following month, the Assembly voted in favor of a set of resolves which asserted that the House of Burgesses had the sole right to tax Virginians. In response, the royal governor, Lord Beaucourt, dissolved the body, forcing the Burgesses to reconvene in a tavern, where they debated and adopted Washington's proposals to boycott the goods subject to taxation under the Townshend Acts. The move had some effect, prompting the new British government under Lord North to repeal the Townshend Acts, keeping only the levies on tea to continue asserting Parliament's right to taxation. The situation had temporarily been diffused, but the remaining taxes on tea provoked the Boston Tea Party on the 16th of December 1773, when a group of men from the American Patriot Organization Sons of Liberty boarded a merchant ship belonging to the East India Company and dumped its valuable cargo of tea into Boston Harbor. While Washington was dismayed by the protest, he was furious at the British response, which involved passing a number of draconian measures against Boston, collectively known as the Intolerable Acts, the most important of which closed the port of Boston to trade until the East India Company was compensated for the loss of cargo. In the House of Burgesses, Washington supported an initiative to show solidarity with Boston by convening a Congress of all 13 colonies to protect their collective rights. In July 1774, while chairing a meeting in Fairfax County, which he had represented since 1765, Washington passed the Fairfax Resolves, which he had drafted alongside George Mason, asserting that taxation and representation are in their nature inseparable. Washington thus became one of the leading advocates of resistance against Britain, and on the 5th of August he was elected to Virginia's 7-man delegation to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which would meet the following month. Surrounded by some of the finest orators of the day, Washington spoke rarely but effectively, bringing together different viewpoints. As the delegates were increasingly convinced that war would break out, Washington's name was on many of their lips when it came to a commander-in-chief. The 42-year-old Washington had developed a sense of political maturity that had been absent in his younger days, and did not actively lobby for the command, confident that his reputation would be enough to secure the post. For the time being, the Continental Congress was content to set up a Continental Association to coordinate efforts among the colonies to ban trade with Great Britain. On the 19th of April 1775, British redcoats and American militiamen exchanged fire at Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts, marking the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Washington had already secured election to the Second Continental Congress, which opened on the 10th of May, with the agenda firmly focused on raising militia and volunteers across the colonies. Washington appeared in the Congress wearing his colonel's uniform, and his expertise in military affairs was in high demand among his fellow delegates. On the 14th of June, the Congress assumed control of the volunteer army, laying siege to the British forces in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, thereby creating the Continental Army, and Washington was appointed General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies on the 16th. While on his way to take command of the Continentals in Boston, Washington received news of the Battle of Bunker Hill on the 17th of June, where 2,000 men under General William Howe successfully captured the American positions, but at the cost of 1,000 casualties, demonstrating that the Continentals were more than capable of putting up a fight. Upon arriving in Boston, Washington sought to instill in his men the idea that they were a national army rather than from a collection of states. Upon inspecting his army, he was disappointed to find that he only had 14,000 men fit for duty living in poor conditions, while supplies of gunpowder were dangerously low. Fearing British spies, he kept quiet about these deficiencies to all but his closest confidants. During this period, the Commander-in-Chief came to be particularly close to Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, as well as 25-year-old artillery commander Colonel Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller who had learned everything about military affairs from the books and the British officers he talked to in his shop. Washington struggled in his efforts to create a professional standing army. Recruits were authorized to serve for 1 year, with the effect that no sooner had they been trained and drilled to fight effectively, they would melt away and return to their homes. As he faced losing his entire army on the 1st of January 1776, Washington attempted to persuade the men to re-enlist, but fewer than 10,000 would agree to do so by the end of the year. In order to bolster numbers, Washington considered recruiting from the black population. While black soldiers had fought in the ranks of the volunteers in Massachusetts and were considered every bit as brave as their white counterparts, as a leading figure of Virginia's slaveholding class, the thought of arming black men raised the prospect of slave rebellion. At a war council in October, Washington prohibited any black soldiers from serving in the Continental Army, but upon hearing that Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, had promised to free slaves who were to join the British Army, Washington compromised and allowed free blacks to serve in his ranks, who would make up around 10% of the Continental Army. As winter approached, Washington realized he could not abandon his army and return to Mount Vernon, and instead invited his wife Martha to stay with him. Martha Washington would spend half the war with her husband on campaign, serving as a trusted confidant for his concerns and anxieties about his army and the war. The condition Washington's men found themselves in during the first winter of the war caused morale to plummet, leading the men to question if their cause could ever succeed. The politicians in Philadelphia were still split on whether to declare independence, and some still believed in petitioning King George III and reconciling with Britain. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense in January 1776 highlighted the tyrannical power of monarchy and galvanized the movement for independence. Spirits further increased on the 17th of January when Henry Knox arrived after accomplishing the incredible logistical feat of hauling almost 60 pieces of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga in New York near the Canadian border across the December snows to Washington's camp. Although Washington still lacked the powder for a full assault on Boston, he successfully maneuvered the cannon onto the Dorchester Heights overlooking the city during the course of a single night on the 4th of March, leaving the British with no choice but to evacuate. Having captured Boston without losing a single man, Washington hurried to New York, believing that General Howe would attempt to take the city. Although the city's geography made it difficult to defend from the British Army, and there was a large population of loyalists sympathizing with the British, Washington recognized the political and commercial importance to the Continental cause and felt compelled to make a stand despite being significantly outnumbered. Meanwhile, the drumbeat for independence was sounding ever louder, and the Declaration of Independence drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Washington's colleague in the Virginia House of Burgesses, was adopted by Congress on the 4th of July 1776 and was received with wild enthusiasm by the Continental Army when Washington read the declaration to them on the 8th. The enthusiasm was premature, as the British Army and Navy, commanded by brothers William and Richard Howe, soon descended on New York at the head of 32,000 men and 70 warships, keen to defeat the rebellion once and for all. By mid-August, Washington had 23,000 men under his command, but most were inexperienced recruits. Meanwhile, when the British landed 2/3 of their force at Long Island, Washington misread it as a diversion and only sent 6,000 men to defend the Brooklyn Heights to the west of the island, keeping most of his men in Manhattan. On the 26th, the Continentals were surrounded by the British, with 300 killed and 1,000 captured. But on the night of the 29th of August, Washington took advantage of Howe's reluctance to stage a full pursuit by evacuating all the men from Long Island to Manhattan. The commander himself was on the last boat across the East River, shrouded from the British by thick fog. A few days later, Washington withdrew from the city to the north. The Continentals had built Fort Washington and Fort Lee overlooking the Hudson River, but these were taken by the British in November, forcing the Continentals to flee across to New Jersey. These setbacks also called into question Washington's command abilities, and his subordinate, General Charles Lee, schemed to replace him. Upon discovering the plot, Washington said nothing to Lee, who received his comeuppance in mid-December when he was captured by the British. Washington's Continental Army was a bedraggled group of fewer than 4,000 men when it crossed the Delaware River to Pennsylvania, while Howe's army was in striking range of Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to evacuate to Baltimore. With little to lose, and with a few thousand extra reinforcements under General Horatio Gates, Washington planned a daring operation back across the Delaware to surprise 3 regiments of Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington planned to cross the river on the night of Christmas Day in order to surprise the enemy, whom he expected to be drunk at the time. Despite a fierce snowstorm, which meant his main column of 2,400 men only got to the other side of the river by 4 in the morning on the 26th, Washington pressed on to Trenton. Although the Hessians were sober, they failed to believe that Washington would attempt such a daring operation in such foul weather. The element of surprise and the effectiveness of Henry Knox's artillery, combined with Washington's effective use of terrain to beat back a counterattack, obliged the Hessians to surrender. The Continentals killed and wounded 100 Hessians and captured 900 more, all for the loss of fewer than 10 men. While Washington is usually considered a defensive general who avoided battle with the odds against him, he was capable of some of the most daring attacks in the history of warfare. The success at Trenton was followed up by a similarly lopsided victory at Princeton a few days later, enabling Washington's men to push forward and expel the British almost completely from New Jersey. The victories provided a boost to morale and allowed Congress to move back to Philadelphia, but with only a few thousand men, Washington was obliged to remain on the defensive, launching frequent raids into enemy territory. In March 1777, the 22-year-old artillery captain Alexander Hamilton joined Washington's staff as aide-de-camp. The talented Hamilton was able to handle much of the commander-in-chief's correspondence and would later become his chief aide. At the end of July, Washington welcomed to his side the Marquis de Lafayette, a 20-year-old French aristocrat who shared in the political ideals of the American Revolution and defied a royal order to travel to America and volunteer his service to the cause. With Lafayette at his side, Washington and Congress hoped that France would be persuaded to join an alliance with the nascent United States.
This episode is brought to you by our sponsor CuriosityStream, the #1 brand in entertainment for people who want to know more. You could think of it as the Hulu for history buffs, or the Disney Plus for the scientist in us. CuriosityStream adds new shows every week and is one of the very best deals in streaming. We've been watching Fighting for Lincoln, The Wide Awake, telling of the supporters who helped get Lincoln elected as president to contend with the issue of slavery and more. It's definitely worth a watch if you enjoy history content that doesn't pull its punches. Another great history documentary we found was the amazing story in Impossible Escapes: Civil War, the story of escape from Libby Prison during the American Civil War, telling how more than 1,000 Union soldiers endured the notorious prison in Richmond until some could take it no more. You will also find lots of other amazing documentaries on subjects such as science, music, technology, travel, as well as nature. Available to watch on all your favorite streaming devices with new shows added every week. Go to curiositystream.com/people or scan the QR code for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for our fans, use promo code PEOPLE and you will save 25% off. It's already one of the most affordable and best deals in streaming. So, click the link below or go to curiositystream.com/people and save 25% right now.
During the first half of 1777, Washington remained on the defensive and awaited Howe's movements. By the end of August, the British commander landed on the Chesapeake Bay and marched on Philadelphia. Keen not to lose the capital without a fight, Washington hurried to cut him off and deployed his army amongst the ravines of Brandywine Creek on the southwestern approaches of the city, anticipating a decisive battle. On the 11th of September, Howe launched his attack, sending 5,000 Hessians to attack Washington's main defensive position in a frontal assault, while he led a force of more than 8,000 men on a long flanking maneuver, aiming to cross the Brandywine at a couple of undefended forts. While the Continentals held firm against the frontal assault, by midday Washington wondered about the whereabouts of the main enemy force, and soon began to receive reports of an enemy flanking maneuver. The American commander realized that he had been outwitted and galloped to the sector in question to find 2 brigades of redcoats, not realizing that Howe's entire force was on its way. By 4 in the afternoon, 3 columns of British troops were thrown into the attack, routing the Continentals. At the end of the battle, the Continentals sustained more than 1,000 casualties, including 400 captured, while British casualties were half the number. The defeat at Brandywine resulted in the British occupation of Philadelphia, forcing Congress to evacuate again, this time to Trenton. Although the Continentals had fought bravely at Brandywine, once again Washington's failure to prepare adequately and his inability to respond quickly when the battle did not unfold as planned resulted in catastrophe for the American cause. The American commander was not disheartened, and on the 3rd of October, less than a month after Brandywine, Washington planned a daring night attack on Howe's camp at Germantown, hoping to repeat his heroics at Trenton the previous winter. However, this time round, Washington's plans unraveled in the middle of the night, and he was forced to abandon the attack after sustaining twice as many casualties as the British once again. He tried his best to make light of the defeat in reports to Congress, and his audacious attack demonstrated to the British that there was still a lot of fight left in the battered and bruised Continental Army. While Washington's main army had suffered a series of setbacks against General Howe on the 17th of October, General Horatio Gates had defeated and captured a British army of 5,000 men under General John Burgoyne at Saratoga in New York, which had been attempting to march south to join Howe. While Washington welcomed the news of Gates' stunning victory, he felt threatened by a subordinate who had previously been a critic and whom he believed was seeking the supreme command for himself. These fears were confirmed when Gates was named as the president of the Congressional Board of War, giving him supervisory powers over Washington and his army. The Board of War also appointed General Thomas Conway as Inspector General, with extensive powers over training and discipline, which bypassed Washington, promoting him to Major General in the process. When Conway arrived at Washington's camp at Valley Forge to announce his appointment, the commander was incensed and informed Conway that his generals would not recognize his authority, obliging Congress to send Conway elsewhere. Washington had stood firm, retained his command, and increased his authority. Washington's quarters for the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, 20 miles to the northwest of Philadelphia, has entered into American legend. For yet another winter, the Continental Army was in a desperate state and risked falling apart, with thousands of men sick, hungry, cold, and demoralized. Washington's efforts to beg Congress for supplies came to nothing, and he came to realize that the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which left most political power with individual states, gave Congress little power and undermined his efforts to create a national army, Yet Washington's presence at the camp helped to keep his men together in these trying times when other armies may have melted away, while Martha Washington's care and attention for the men won her respect and affection throughout the ranks. Washington was also helped by the arrival of Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had served in Frederick the Great's armies during the 7 Years' War. The Prussian army was considered the best in Europe, famous for its discipline and order, attributes which the Continentals sorely lacked. Within a matter of weeks, Steuben drilled the army in line and column formations and associated maneuvers, and also began working on a drill manual, which would remain in use by the United States Army for almost a century. By the beginning of March, Washington had 12,000 men at his disposal, ready for action. A far more significant boost to the American war effort came in the form of an alliance with France, signed in Paris on the 6th of February 1778. The alliance changed the strategic picture of the war, forcing the British troops under their new commander Sir Henry Clinton to withdraw from Philadelphia to New York and attach 8,000 men to defend the West Indies from the French. While Clinton's men were on the retreat, Washington ordered General Charles Lee, recently released in a prisoner exchange, to take up his previous role as second-in-command, to lead a vanguard of 5,000 men against the British at Monmouth Court House. Lee, who had advised against the operation, launched a half-hearted attack that was easily repulsed by the British, sending the Continentals reeling and inviting a counterattack. A furious Washington rallied his reserve of 6,000 men and managed to turn the tide of the battle during 2 hours of fierce fighting. Washington decided against sending his exhausted army to pursue the British, who managed to slip away to safety in the middle of the night. In the weeks following the battle, General Lee was court-martialed and found guilty, and Washington was happy to see the back of him. For the next 3 years, the British forces turned their attention to the south. During this period, Washington would not fight a major battle, though he was by no means inactive. In the summer of 1778, the French Navy sailed up the Chesapeake to join Washington, though the cooperation between the subjects of an absolute monarchy and the citizens of a revolutionary republic was far from seamless, as the Americans realized that the French were motivated foremost by animosity against the British rather than support for the American cause, and once again Washington found himself interacting with European military officers who looked down on Americans and rarely kept him updated on their whereabouts. The following summer, Washington managed to stop Clinton from controlling the Hudson River and cutting off New England from the rest of the United States, but this period otherwise proved uneventful. By 1780, Washington's army was low on money and supplies, and military success seemed impossible without the assistance of the French. Lafayette had been in France since the beginning of 1779 and lobbied for greater French assistance to the American cause. King Louis XVI answered the call by sending an expeditionary force of 6,000 men to America under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, in conjunction with the fleet commanded by the Chevalier de Ternay, who landed in Newport, Rhode Island on the 10th of July 1780. Meanwhile, the Continentals had suffered a series of setbacks in the south, beginning with the loss of the port of Charleston in South Carolina in May, and followed by Horatio Gates' defeat to General Charles Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina on the 16th of August, whose dismissal by Congress in the aftermath of the debacle removed the final challenger to Washington's authority in the Continental Army. Worse was to follow in late September, when Washington belatedly recognized the treachery of Benedict Arnold, the courageous Continental Army officer who had fought with distinction at Saratoga, but had been nursing a wounded ego after being overlooked for promotion. In August, Arnold had been appointed commandant of the vital strategic fort of West Point, but rather than strengthen his defences, he plotted to surrender it to the British, managing to escape just in time when the plot was discovered. By 1781, British successes in the South and Arnold's defection threatened Washington's home state of Virginia. Governor Thomas Jefferson, whose own home at Monticello had been occupied by Arnold's men, urged Washington to lead his men south to defend his home state. Though the American commander was anxious about the fate of his beloved Mount Vernon and had sent a division under Lafayette to confront Arnold in Virginia, Washington preferred to keep his men in New York and believed the decisive blow against the British would fall there, though his French allies planned an operation in the south instead. By mid-August, Washington abandoned his designs on New York when he received news that a French fleet of 29 ships under the command of Admiral de Grasse had set sail from the West Indies and intended to land a force of 3,500 men on the Chesapeake in early September. Washington had also received news from Lafayette that Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown, located on the eastern tip of the Virginia Peninsula and surrounded by water on three sides. Washington and Rochambeau hurried south in an effort to trap Cornwallis and force him to surrender. By the beginning of September, de Grasse's fleet had arrived on the Chesapeake as planned, overcoming limited British resistance, leaving Cornwallis trapped between the French ships at sea and Lafayette's small force on land. By the 18th of September, Washington and Rochambeau met with the admiral to discuss plans for the siege. De Grasse was adamant that he would have to return to the West Indies no later than the 1st of November, allowing little more than a month for the operation. When Washington and Rochambeau began to lay siege to Yorktown on the 28th of September, the American commander deferred to his French counterpart, who was more experienced in siege tactics. Cornwallis's army of 9,000 men was significantly outnumbered by the 19,000 French and Americans besieging Yorktown, and the British general desperately pleaded for additional reinforcements from General Clinton. After the French engineers built 2 lines of trenches, allowing Allied artillery to rain down cannonballs into Yorktown on the 14th, the Allies successfully captured 2 British redoubts in front of the town, and by the 16th they were so close to the British lines that Cornwallis attempted a last-ditch evacuation across the York River, which was scuppered by poor weather. On the morning of the 17th of October 1783, Cornwallis sent Washington a message to discuss the terms of surrender, which were signed on the 19th. Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown did not end the war, but it persuaded the authorities in London that it was no longer worth sustaining the costly effort to retain the American colonies. Upon hearing of the news of Yorktown, Lord North is said to have exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over," and his government duly collapsed in early 1782. Henry Clinton was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Sir Guy Carleton, whose role was largely reduced to organizing the evacuation of British assets from their former colonies. Washington regarded Carleton's peace offers with suspicion and still anticipated continued hostilities. However, aside from a handful of skirmishes in the south over the course of 1782, the war was over, and preliminary peace terms were signed in Paris on the 30th of November, 1782, an extraordinarily generous settlement recognizing the independence of the United States of America, with borders stretching north to the Great Lakes and west to the Mississippi, setting the stage for a final peace ratified in September 1783. Although he had been the most powerful individual in the United States with an army at his disposal, Washington chose to return to life as a private citizen at Mount Vernon and relinquished his commission on the 23rd of December 1783, Following the example of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, the 5th century BC Roman general, famed for relinquishing his powers as dictator after being summoned to defeat Rome's enemies. Upon returning to Mount Vernon, Washington set out to give his estate a new lease of life after the neglect it had suffered during the war. During this period, Washington was courted by anti-slavery campaigners including Lafayette, who proposed an experiment to educate and free slaves who would become tenant farmers. Washington had always believed slavery was an economically inefficient institution, and after the war he became morally opposed to slavery, but he could not bear overhauling the entire economic system on which his livelihood as a planter depended. Like many of his fellow planters, Washington naively believed that the institution of slavery would die out naturally in the future. Despite his desire to leave public life, Washington's reputation meant that he could not remain in obscurity for long. Throughout the war, he had longed for a stronger central government that could compel the states to supply his army, and he had not departed from this belief. Washington therefore welcomed an initiative to revise the Articles of Confederation led by his former aide Alexander Hamilton and the Virginian politician James Madison, and was invited by the latter to head a delegation from Virginia to a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, scheduled for May 1787. After months of hesitation, Washington answered the call of duty and was duly elected President of the Constitutional Convention on the 25th of May. The role was a perfect fit for the non-partisan Washington, who intervened occasionally to broker agreement between different points of view. The convention was dominated by two major questions, both relating to representation. The more populous states, such as Virginia, wanted an assembly with seats allocated according to population, while smaller states desired equal representation. In mid-July, a compromise was reached whereby all states would be represented equally with 2 members in the Senate, while the seats of the House of Representatives would be based on population. The second compromise was over slavery. While slaves would not have any political rights, slave-holding states could count 3/5 of the slave population in determining their representation in Congress. The convention also created an independent executive branch from Congress, and it was widely assumed that Washington would become the first president. The proceedings in Philadelphia were concluded on the 17th of September 1787, but it was not until July 1788 when the Constitution was ratified, with Washington's native Virginia being one of the last to do so. Washington hesitated to declare his candidacy for the presidency, responding to fears that he might have royal ambitions, though his reputation as the American Cincinnatus and his childless status helped to calm fears of a hereditary monarchy and led admirers to call him Father of the Country. Thus, when the presidential election was held in early 1789, Washington was unanimously elected president, while John Adams of Massachusetts was elected vice president. After the election was certified on the 6th of April, Washington traveled to New York, the temporary home of the federal government, and was inaugurated as president on the 30th of April 1789. When Washington took office as president, the institutions of the federal government were still being set up. The Constitution had left the duties of the president deliberately vague, and it was up to Congress and Washington to delineate their respective powers. Washington's 4-man cabinet was assembled by the spring of 1790, including his former subordinates in the army and his fellow Virginians. Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Jefferson's cousin Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. The Constitution did not provide for a cabinet in the British sense, and Washington typically worked directly with his cabinet secretaries. In the early stages of his presidency, Washington also relied heavily on the advice of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who served as a congressman representing Virginia in the House of Representatives. Washington's vice president, John Adams, played a minor role in his administration and took his duties as president of the Senate more seriously. Among Washington's cabinet secretaries, the most brilliant was Alexander Hamilton, who labored hard to strengthen the power of the federal government, carrying out his duties as tirelessly as he had done as Washington's chief aide during the Revolutionary War. Unlike the president, Hamilton had a grand vision for the architecture of the federal government, and had also developed an expertise in financial matters that Washington could not match, effectively making him into an unofficial prime minister. Despite being an admirer of Washington, Jefferson viewed Hamilton's designs with suspicion, believing that they would lead to a despotic presidency, and criticized the president privately for going along with such ideas. The Hamilton and Jefferson rivalry reflected the intellectual and ideological debate over the future direction of the American government, and while Washington allowed free debate among his cabinet members, he was no impartial observer and played an active role in decision-making, controlling the agenda and requesting papers from his cabinet secretaries for his personal approval each day. Washington's leadership style was slow and deliberative, and he consulted widely before making decisions, a privilege that he did not have while a general in the heat of battle. The debate over Hamilton's economic agenda dominated Washington's presidency. In January 1790, Hamilton delivered his Report on the Public Credit, which proposed the creation of a national debt to be paid over time and financed by new taxes. Additionally, Hamilton proposed that the federal government should assume state debts, in effect transferring the loyalty of debt holders from the states to the national government. Washington shared Hamilton's belief in a powerful national government which could raise funds to meet its financial obligations, and was happy to let his Treasury Secretary work out the details. Any talk of taxation brought up memories of British colonial rule, prompting Madison to come out in opposition and break his alliance with Hamilton and Washington, withholding congressional support for the proposals. The president was disappointed by the loss of a close ally, as well as the beginnings of the split between the northern and southern states, which would continue to define American politics until the present day. Washington would also prove a supporter of Hamilton's proposals for a national bank, despite the arguments from Jefferson and his fellow Virginians that such a move would be unconstitutional. The debate over the public debt coincided with disagreements about the location of the permanent capital of the United States. Many Southerners hoped to bring the capital further to the south, and Madison favored a location in Virginia along the banks of the Potomac, where both he and Washington had property. Naturally, the president welcomed this prospect, but Congress was now deadlocked on both issues. A crucial meeting between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison in June 1790 saw the three men broker a deal whereby the Virginians agreed to drop opposition to Hamilton's economic program in return for Hamilton supporting the proposal to move to Philadelphia as a temporary capital for 10 years while a permanent one was being built on the Potomac. Washington was given power to choose the site and duly picked a location not far from Mount Vernon, and the commissioners he had chosen to oversee the project later decided to name the city Washington, in the District of Columbia. The two debates which had threatened to dissolve the Union were therefore both resolved in Washington's favor. The debate over the future of the Union and the powers of the federal government easily spilled over into foreign affairs. Although he had fought against the British, Washington and Hamilton realized that the prosperity of the United States remained dependent on trade and commerce with the former imperial master, which recovered rapidly after the end of the war. Jefferson, Washington's Secretary of State and Chief Foreign Policy Advisor, remained attached to France, especially after Louis XVI's absolute monarchy was overthrown by the Revolution of 1789, which Jefferson witnessed firsthand as ambassador to France shortly before his return to the United States. Lafayette had emerged as one of the leaders of the revolutionary government, inspired by the ideas of liberty which he had fought for in America. Washington feared that the French Revolution may descend into mob violence, a fear that proved prophetic in the subsequent years when the radical Jacobin faction took over in September 1792 and executed King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette the following year, while Lafayette was forced into exile. Despairing in Hamilton and Jefferson's rivalry, whose supporters had coalesced into two parties, the Federalists and Republicans respectively, Washington sought to bring the two men together. Despite his skill in finding common ground across political divides at the Continental Congress and in the Constitutional Convention, the president struggled to do so in the face of these two towering personalities who had taken to attacking each other by writing anonymous letters in the press. Washington intended to step down from the presidency after one term, but was persuaded by both men to stay on, believing that he was the only man who could keep the country together. During the winter of 1792, he was re-elected to a second term, while Adams remained in post as vice president, seeing off a challenge from Jefferson. However, the Jeffersonian Republicans had won a clear majority in the House of Representatives, setting the stage for strong congressional opposition to Washington's administration during his second term. Washington's second term was dominated by foreign policy issues arising from the war which had broken out between Britain and France in 1792, while Jefferson argued that the United States and France were still allies from the war. Hamilton and Knox believed that the alliance was null and void now that Louis XVI had been overthrown and executed. Washington hoped to remain neutral between the two warring nations, knowing that the United States was too weak to exert much diplomatic or military pressure. Following Washington's proclamation of American neutrality on the 22nd of April 1793, the French envoy Edmond Charles Genet went to Philadelphia in an effort to persuade the United States to go to war against Britain. While the Frenchman proved popular among the American public, Washington received him coldly as someone seeking to interfere in American politics. Genet made matters worse by encouraging French privateers attacking British shipping to sail into American ports, and threatened to go over Washington's head and appeal to the American people. These insults damaged the pro-French cause and prompted the American cabinet to ask for Genet's recall. But upon learning that the Jacobins were recalling their envoy and planned to put him on trial, Washington granted him asylum in the United States. The conduct of the British during this period also increased tensions with the United States. In the summer of 1793, the British began to intercept neutral ships bound for French ports, thereby confiscating the cargo of American ships. The British Navy's practice of impressment, rounding up British deserters aboard American ships to serve in the Navy, frequently caught innocent Americans in the net. Responding to Federalist calls for a special envoy to be sent to Britain to negotiate a treaty of commerce and defuse the threat of war, Washington dispatched John Jay, an experienced diplomat who was serving as Chief Justice, a choice which raised questions about the separation of powers between the judicial and executive branches of government. The treaty negotiated by Jay in February 1795 did not address all of the American grievances and tilted the economic relationship in favor of Britain, but stopped the drift towards war. Washington was prepared to sign this imperfect document, but its publication in the press provoked outrage among the Republicans. Jefferson had left his post of Secretary of State in 1793 and attempted to rally House Republicans to withhold funding to implement the treaty. The attempt failed narrowly, but promoted Washington to break his ties with his erstwhile friend and advisor. Washington's support for the Jay Treaty provoked a tide of Republican criticism, and the luster of his exploits during the Revolutionary War was no longer sufficient to shore up his reputation in Jeffersonian circles. Exhausted by the burdens of office and having suffered from a series of illnesses during his presidency, the 64-year-old Washington announced his desire to retire from public life after serving out his second term. By doing so, he created a powerful precedent of a two-term limit that would only be broken once. In his farewell address, drafted by Hamilton and published in September 1796, the departing president pleaded for national unity in the face of domestic and international challenges. Washington was succeeded by John Adams on the 4th of March 1797, but his calls for unity went unheeded, and the factionalism between the Federalists and Republicans would only become more intense. Washington's retirement would prove to be short, and when war with France appeared imminent in 1798, Washington was named as the head of the army, but his efforts to have Alexander Hamilton as his second-in-command in the stead of more senior officers such as Henry Knox was vigorously opposed by President Adams, poisoning Washington's relations with both Adams and Knox. Diplomatic overtures to France managed to avert the tide of war, and Washington returned to Mount Vernon. He retained an active interest in farming matters despite his advanced age, and on the 12th of December 1799, he spent 5 hours riding around his estate, encountering an unexpected snowstorm. The exposure to the elements made him ill, and he died on the 14th of December 1799. A few months before his death, Washington wrote a new will which stipulated that his property would pass on to Martha, but upon her death, the 120 slaves he left her would be freed. Martha had not been consulted on the will and was afraid that the slaves might be motivated to kill her, and decided to free her late husband's slaves on the 1st of January 1801, a little more than a year before her own death in May 1802. Washington's death was met with widespread mourning across the United States, and he continues to be admired as one of America's greatest generals and presidents. Over the course of his 67 years, he had been a key participant in some of the most important events in world history. Born into a colonial family of modest means, Washington began his military career as a headstrong officer in the British colonial army, resentful of his treatment by London. He would end it as the man who defeated one of the most formidable European armies in war, securing independence for a country founded on the principles of liberty and equality. He would then play a key role in the establishment and consolidation of the American political system by presiding over the Constitutional Convention and serving as the first President of the United States. Washington's belief in a strong federal government to ensure the security and prosperity of the new nation made him an opponent of his fellow Virginian planters, but helped to pave the way for the United States to become the global hegemon of the 21st century. The universal admiration for Washington may overlook some of his deficiencies as a soldier and politician. Over the course of his military career, Washington lost more battles than he won, and his mistakes at New York and Brandywine were responsible for devastating defeats. While Washington managed to keep his army alive, he could not have dealt the victorious blow at Yorktown without the assistance of the French army and navy. As a politician, Washington lacked the intellectual vision of the likes of Hamilton and Jefferson, and was naive to believe that it was possible to avoid the partisan divides that have defined American politics ever since. On the issue of slavery, while Washington's attitude later in life was far more progressive than most of his peers, he was unwilling to challenge the Southern planters on the future of the institution, even after breaking with them on Hamilton's economic program. Instead, he would defer the issue to future generations of political leaders. What do you think of George Washington? Was he a great military figure whose inspirational leadership enabled a ragtag army to defeat the might of the British Empire, and a skillful politician whose pragmatism held the Union together while the Constitution laid down its roots? Or was he a mediocre general and a politician who was given the credit rightfully belonging to his subordinates and allies, both in war and politics? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Ulysses S. Grant was born as Hiram Ulysses Grant on the 27th of April 1822 in Point Pleasant, a small rural community in the southwest of the relatively young state of Ohio. His father was Jesse Root Grant, a farmer, tanner, and leather merchant who hailed originally from Pennsylvania, and who could trace his ancestry in America back to the first establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Jesse had moved westwards along with so many Americans in the early 19th century in search of new opportunities as the United States expanded from the east coast of North America. Ulysses' mother was Hannah Grant, originally Hannah Simpson. Her ancestry lay amongst the Presbyterian Scots, who had moved from Scotland to Ulster in the north of Ireland during the 17th century, and then emigrated again in great numbers from Ireland to North America in the course of the 18th century. She had married Jesse Grant in 1821, and Ulysses was their first child. She was a deeply religious woman, and Ulysses is believed to have taken after his mother more than his father, although he might well have acquired his anti-slavery stance from Jesse, who was a proclaimed abolitionist, meaning that he wished for slavery to be brought to an end throughout the United States. Ulysses would grow up in a large household, as he had 5 siblings: Simpson, Clara, Orville, Jenny, and Mary. The family was well enough off that Ulysses was provided with a substantial education at numerous private schools. This included a stint at the Rankin Academy in 1838. This was run by John Rankin, a noted abolitionist and educator who was prominent in running the Underground Railroad at the time. This was a system of safe houses and transport networks which abolitionists in America used to help escape slaves in the southern states of America to flee from slavery. Grant was growing up at a time when the United States was expanding swiftly, having largely been confined to a series of states along the eastern seaboard of North America in the 18th century. American eyes were turning west from 1800 onwards, with expansion towards the Great Lakes in the north and westwards towards the Mississippi River and the border with Spain's colonial possessions in Texas, New Mexico, and California. Beyond this territorial expansion, the social fabric of the country was shifting dramatically. Under British rule, slavery had been practiced throughout the colonies, though it was engaged in to a much greater extent in the southern colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, with their sprawling cotton and tobacco plantations. Change was on the way though, as by 1800 a number of northern states, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, inspired by the abolitionist movement, had banned slavery. By the time of Grant's birth, others, such as New Jersey, had become free states, while the period of his youth and adolescence saw the states directly to the west, such as Illinois and Michigan, follow their more liberal neighbors to the east. but the southern states remained unswerving in their defense of the institution of slavery, and so the stage was already being set during Grant's youth for a titanic struggle between the northern and southern states. Ultimately, Ulysses would find himself foisted into the conflicts of American society in the mid-19th century, owing to a decision made by his father in 1839. At this time, when Ulysses was still just 17, his father requested an acquaintance to nominate his son to the United States Military Academy at West Point in the state of New York, then, as now, the leading military academy in the United States. The application was successful, though, owing to an error in his registration, Hiram Ulysses Grant was recorded as Cadet Ulysses S. Grant on entry. This new name stuck. Grant was initially skeptical about life at West Point, but he eventually grew into it, acquiring a reputation while there for his equestrian skills. Though, more broadly, he was only an average pupil. When he graduated in June 1843, he did so ranked 21st of 39 cadets in his class. Having finished at West Point, he was quickly appointed to the 4th Infantry Division and sent to St. Louis in the state of Missouri as a brevet second lieutenant. Grant seems to have been relatively uncommitted to a military career at this point and considered this a temporary posting, from which he might retire in a year or two. Yet it was a highly significant period in other ways. While at West Point, Grant had befriended Frederick Tracy Dent, a fellow cadet who was slightly older than Ulysses. Dent originally hailed from Whitehaven near St. Louis, and Grant became a regular visitor at the Dent household following his arrival in Missouri. He had soon struck up a relationship with Dent's sister, Julia, and in 1844 they were engaged. The union, though, would not be formalized into a marriage for another 4 years, as war on the southern border interrupted their plans in this regard. The war, which erupted in 1846, was the direct result of the contentious position of Texas between the United States and Mexico, traditionally part of Spain's colonial possessions in Central America. Texas had become part of Mexico when the country acquired independence from its mother country, Spain, in the early 1820s. However, Texas's position within the broader Mexican state was always contentious, and in 1836 it broke away into a new Republic of Texas. Thereafter, it gravitated towards the U.S., and when he was elected as president late in 1844, a major plank of James Polk's policy platform was expansion of the United States into Texas. This was duly accomplished in 1845 with the formal annexation of the Republic of Texas. However, Mexico was unwilling to accept this new dispensation. In particular, a boundary dispute arose over where the new border between the US and Mexico should lie, Polk's administration favoring the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government arguing that the frontier should be located along the more northerly Nueces River. These issues spilled over into war in 1846. Grant's role in the war was limited as a junior officer, but also formative in its own way, as he fought at the Battle of Palo Alto, the first major clash of the war, near Brownsville in Texas on the 8th of May 1846. It was also the first time Grant had seen active combat. He subsequently served as a regimental quartermaster further west towards California and then in Mexico itself in 1847. He earned a commendation for his role in the Battle of Molino del Rey, fought near Mexico City in September 1847. And so, while he did not have any major command during the US-Mexican War, it is increasingly viewed as an important period in his career as a military commander. It was between 1846 and 1848 that Grant gained his first experience of warfare, and it was to be the only war he fought in prior to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, and as such, it must be considered his most active training period for the later conflict. Ultimately, the US-Mexican War ended in a total US victory. Having secured the border regions in the opening months of the conflict, General Winfield Scott advanced into Mexico itself in the spring of 1847, eventually occupying Mexico City, a campaign which Grant was involved in. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, agreed in February 1848, saw Mexico acknowledge U.S. control over Texas, while the Rio Grande was established as the border between the two nations. Consequently, while the U.S. did not take the opportunity provided by its complete military victory to acquire further land from Mexico, the peace essentially consolidated its position in Texas and established the modern border between the two countries. In the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexican War, Grant returned to St. Louis and married Julia Dent. Theirs was a close relationship, though initially it caused a rupture between Grant and his parents, who were discontented with the Dents being slave owners. Despite their family squabbling, which continued with varying degrees of intensity for decades to come, there is little doubting Ulysses and Julia's affection for one another. She had a cast in her left eye and squinted as a result of it, a characteristic which years later, when Ulysses became president, she considered having surgery to correct. He vetoed the idea, stating that he loved her just as she was. Evidently, it was Julia's liveliness and other character traits which made Ulysses devoted to her. Eventually, they would have 4 children, 3 boys, Frederick, Ulysses Jr., and Jesse, and a girl named Ellen. But Ulysses and Julia's early family life was repeatedly interrupted by Grant's military postings. In the years following the U.S.-Mexican War, he was moved around several times to different military commands in Detroit and New York State. But it was finally to California that he was dispatched in the early 1850s. Gold had been discovered out on the West Coast, and as settlement increased there around the middle of the century, a heightened military presence was needed. Julia was heavily pregnant at the time, and Grant was forced to leave her in the east, while he headed west. The next few years were a bleak period. Grant was moved around repeatedly across California and the Oregon Territory. In an effort to better support his young family back home, he entered into several business ventures on the side, each of which failed. Then he started drinking more heavily, the beginnings of a long acquaintance he would have with the bottle. And eventually it was repeated acts of drunkenness and the clashes these caused with his commanding officers which led him to resign from the military on the 31st of September 1854. Thus, at 32 years of age, and with no idea of what he might do henceforth, Grant headed back east to St. Louis to be reunited with his wife and family. Life outside the military, though, did not bring any relief from his hardships, as back in St. Louis, things went from bad to worse. Having accepted a farm allotment from Julia's father, he nevertheless continued to struggle financially, in part owing to an economic recession in the U.S. in 1857. A venture into real estate proved abortive, and in the late 1850s, Grant was reduced to selling firewood on a St. Louis street corner to make some extra cash, and even pawned a gold watch, a prized possession at one point. Years later, F. Scott Fitzgerald would state that there are no second acts in American life. He should perhaps have considered the highly successful second act of Ulysses S. Grant before making this assertion. In the early 1860s, Grant's life was to take a striking turn, brought about almost entirely by the crisis which enveloped America in the aftermath of the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States in the presidential election of November 1860. Tensions had been brewing for decades between the free states in the north of the United States and the slave-owning states of the South. Now in 1860, Lincoln, though willing to compromise with the slave-owning states, was built into a bogeyman by the southern states, one who would seek to end slavery altogether in America. As a result, upon his election, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. It was soon joined by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas in that decision, and these 7 breakaway southern states formed themselves into a confederacy. Outright armed hostilities between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy commenced in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked a Union-held garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, following which several more southern states seceded and joined the Confederacy, the capital of which was eventually established at Richmond in Virginia. The American Civil War had begun. Upon the outbreak of hostilities in the spring of 1861, Grant rejoined the army after a near 7-year absence. In the initial stages of the conflict, he was involved in efforts to recruit and train forces in Missouri and Illinois, but it was not long before he had been given a command in southern Illinois, based on his previous military experience. He would spend the first year of the war operating in the border region between southern Illinois and Kentucky, and further south towards Tennessee, playing a delicate balancing act in areas where military heavy-handedness was frowned upon, in the hopes that these communities straddling the North and the South could be won over to the Union cause. At the beginning of 1862, frustrated by his lack of major commands, Grant sought and received permission from General Henry Halleck to undertake an offensive campaign. Campaigning south with 25,000 men, he won one of the first major victories of the war for the Union when he besieged and captured Fort Donelson on the River Cumberland in Tennessee. About 15,000 Confederate troops in total were captured in the engagement. Moreover, Grant had proved his daring and activist approach. When the commander of Fort Donelson had inquired as to what terms of surrender might be offered, Grant had replied that the only terms he was prepared to offer were unconditional surrender, as he intended to move presently against the fort. As a result of his actions at Fort Donelson, Grant was now promoted to the rank of Major General. 2 months later, he was the major Union commander at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee on the 6th of April 1862, where over 100,000 Union and Confederate troops fought. Grant was theoretically victorious and repelled the Confederate incursion into the region, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, which resulted in over 10,000 Union troops being either killed or wounded. Grant's reputation, which had soared following the seizure of Fort Donelson, was now damaged. This was probably not aided by reports of his drinking. While we can probably dismiss legendary tales about Grant keeping a barrel of whiskey outside his tent while on campaign during the Civil War, there seems to be much truth to allegations that he was a heavy binge drinker on occasion, although one who often abstained for considerable periods of time. The most likely scenario suggests that Grant was prone to bouts of heavy drinking, but rarely drank heavily when he knew some important task lay ahead of him. Despite these setbacks, before the end of 1862, Grant had convinced his superiors to allow him to proceed towards Mississippi, where he planned to seize Vicksburg, one of the Confederates' major strongholds on the Mississippi River. This he duly succeeded in accomplishing 6 months later, when it finally surrendered on the 4th of July 1863. Grant's actions here were particularly notable, as the Vicksburg campaign ensured Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two, between those states further to the west and the core of the southern states to the east of the Mississippi. While Grant was making a major name for himself in Tennessee and Mississippi, the war was proceeding with mixed results for both sides. While 1861 had seen the outbreak of the war and the consolidation of the Confederacy, in 1862 it settled into a particularly intense campaign in the eastern states around Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, where the Union and Confederacy were in the peculiar position of having their respective capitals less than 100 miles away from each other. But it was in 1863 that the war really turned. It was this year that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, making the abolition of slavery in the Confederate States a stated war goal for the Union. Henceforth, it was clear that victory for the Union in the war would mean an end to the institution of slavery throughout the United States. Having won a significant victory repelling the Union forces at Chancellorsville in Virginia, the leading Confederate general Robert E. Lee undertook a campaign into the north through Pennsylvania in the early summer of 1863. This culminated in the 3-day-long Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania between the 1st and 3rd of July, the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War. Gettysburg saw Lee's Army of Northern Virginia heavily defeated, with nearly 25,000 of his 75,000-man army either killed or wounded. It was a turning point in the entire conflict, which, combined with Grant's seizure of Vicksburg to the west a day later on the 4th of July, put the Union on the offensive. It has also gone down in history as much for Lincoln's address to mark the battle the following November, in which he spoke of the great Civil War being fought to ensure that freedom shall not perish from the earth. Meanwhile, in recognition of his prowess in the field and accomplishments in the seizure of Vicksburg and other strategic sites, Grant was appointed as Lieutenant General in March 1864 and placed in overall command of the Union Army. He was now in charge of the effort to finally defeat the Confederacy and bring the war to an end. Grant's strategy was relatively simple in 1864. He intended to use the Union's numerical superiority to essentially confine Robert E. Lee's forces, protecting Richmond within the state of Virginia, while several of his sub-commanders would conduct campaigns further to the south and southwest, for instance, seizing Georgia. This strategy was broadly successful elsewhere, although despite the tightening of the noose on Richmond, Grant failed to take the Confederate capital in 1864, even after a near 2-week-long bloody engagement at Cold Harbor some 10 miles from the city ended in a stalemate. Grant's forces now settled in June 1864 into what would become a 9-month siege of the town of Petersburg, not far from Richmond. As it wore on, though, the siege of Petersburg became symptomatic of the Confederate cause in general. The breakaway affiliation was now largely confined to isolated centers of control out further west in Alabama and Texas, and a strip of land running along the east coast around Virginia and parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. By the autumn of 1864, the city of Atlanta in Georgia had been captured, and the Union Army had advanced as far as the Atlantic coast in parts of the South. As the winter set in, Lee's troops in Virginia began to desert in large numbers, owing to starvation and the general hopelessness of the Confederate cause. And by the spring of 1865, Lee's position was hopeless. The American Civil War eventually came to an end on the 9th of April 1865. A week earlier, Lee had abandoned the line which he had been trying to hold around Petersburg. Richmond was now open to a Union advance. As a result, on the 9th of April, Lee agreed to meet with Grant in the courthouse in the village of Appomattox in Virginia to negotiate the surrender of the Confederacy. Here, the two generals reminisced about their experiences in the war with Mexico nearly 20 years earlier, before getting round to the business of ending the Civil War. Grant, for his part, was authorized to negotiate that there would be few reprisals of any kind for those who laid down their weapons. As a result, when word spread west to the Confederate forces in those states, the surrender was quickly agreed to, and the last fighting occurred in Texas at the end of May. Yet the man who had been at the center of these events would never live to see the ultimate cessation of hostilities. On the 14th of April, just 5 days after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a stage actor and Confederate sympathizer, in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Grant himself had nearly been present with Lincoln, having turned down an offer to attend the performance with the president. Indeed, allegations flew in the days that followed that Grant was also a target of Booth and his co-conspirators. They were unsuccessful if he was. Grant lived, and Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, was sworn in as the great man's successor. The end of the war witnessed the inception of the policy of Reconstruction. On the surface, this was aimed primarily at bringing slavery to an end in the Confederate States and ending the remnants of secession in the South. But such was the manner in which slavery was ingrained into every aspect of the economy and society of the Southern states that Reconstruction would also necessarily require a massive program of social and economic reform if the Southern states were to evolve to become more like their more liberal Union neighbors to the north. Reconstruction would dominate U.S. politics during the immediate aftermath of the war, and primarily throughout Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877. Even prior to his tenure in the White House, Grant was involved in Reconstruction politics. In the months after the conclusion of the Civil War, he was sent on a tour of the Southern states at the behest of President Johnson. This was important for two reasons. Grant was received favorably during his travels throughout the former Confederate states, somewhat surprisingly given his position as the Union's foremost general. This indicated that he could be a unifying figure during the Reconstruction period. Secondly, Grant submitted a report to Johnson upon completion of his tour, in which he recommended a lenient approach towards the former Confederate states he had just visited, in order to help end the bitterness of the Civil War. His drift towards politics did not end there. In 1866, he was appointed a general of the Federal Army, now that the Union titles of recent years were dispensed with. And then, in 1867, when Johnson removed Edwin M. Stanton from his position as Secretary of War, Grant was offered the position. Grant accepted the office on an interim basis in August 1867. However, a constitutional problem now arose surrounding the Tenure of Office Act. This dictated that a sitting cabinet secretary could only be removed by the executive with the consent of the Senate. As such, Johnson needed Stanton's removal to be sanctioned by the upper house of Congress. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's dismissal in December 1867, Grant resigned in January, provoking a split with Johnson in the process, who had believed that Grant would refuse to relinquish his position as Secretary of War. This resulted in the decision over Stanton being sent to the courts for adjudication, Johnson's desired outcome. The major outcome of the split from Johnson and Grant's brief flirtation with the office of Secretary of War was that he was now viewed as a potential presidential candidate within the Republican Party. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago in mid-May 1868, Grant won the party's support. He would run against the Democrat Horatio Seymour, a former governor of the state of New York. The Civil War hero ran in the months that followed on a campaign slogan of "Let us have peace." Ultimately, the election race was much closer than many observers had expected. Overall, Grant won by just 300,000 votes in the popular vote, although the Electoral College result was much more comprehensive, Grant securing 214 votes compared to just 80 for Seymour. As a result, on the 4th of March 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn into office as the 18th President of the United States. He would serve for 8 years, winning a second term in 1872, with a much more comprehensive victory over a divided opposition. During the 8 years in which he served as President of the United States, Grant would have to grapple with a large number of very grave challenges. None was more pressing than the issue of Reconstruction and the reunifying of the country after the trauma of a 4-year civil war. 2 weeks after entering office, he signed laws guaranteeing African Americans equal rights. Then, in the months that followed, his administration pressured those former Confederate states which had not ratified the 15th Amendment into doing so. This would guarantee Black Americans the right to vote in elections. The trade-off for the Southern states in accepting this would be readmittance to the Union once it had been ratified by each state legislature. As a result of this carrot-and-stick approach, by 1871 the recalcitrant states, including Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas, had complied and were readmitted to the Union. But in other respects, Reconstruction under Grant proved more difficult. Armed bands of traditional Southern conservatives sprung up across the former Confederate states in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan was just the most prominent of these, and others, such as the Red Shirts and White League, collectively termed Redeemers, strove to use violence and intimidation to reclaim control of the southern states of the Democratic Party and force through a white supremacist agenda. In response, Grant's administration created the U.S. Justice Department and charged it with cracking down on white Redeemer movements in the South. In tandem, the Federal Army was dispatched to key sites in order to maintain law and order and defend Reconstruction. The result, it is generally acknowledged, is that Grant's administration crushed the power of the Ku Klux Klan for a generation in the South by arresting hundreds of senior members and prosecuting many of its most powerful benefactors who financed the Klan. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, it was clear by the mid-1870s that Reconstruction was largely failing, and Redeemer Democrats were seeking to create a society in the South, which, in the absence of slavery, would still disenfranchise and savagely oppress the large African American population across the former Confederate states. Reconstruction was intimately tied to the finances of the country. During the war, the Union government had resorted to issuing banknotes that were not backed up by the gold or silver standard. In the 19th century, all Western governments only issued money that was backed by a certain amount of gold and silver bullion reserves. The emergency caused by the Civil War had seen Lincoln's administration resorting to simply printing banknotes, resulting in considerable inflation. To correct the situation, Grant passed the Public Credit Act within 3 weeks of entering office. This essentially promised those who held banknotes issued during the Civil War that they would be repaid in coin backed by the gold and silver standard. The idea here was to curb inflation and also introduce much greater confidence into the financial system that the Civil War banknotes, termed greenback notes, were as good as real money and would not become worthless now that the war was receding in the collective memory. The overall effect of this was a continuation of the economic recovery, which had already started under Johnson's administration between 1865 and 1869. Yet it was not all smooth sailing on the financial front across the 8 years of Grant's administration. In 1873, an economic crisis developed following the collapse of the New York brokerage firm J. Cook & Company, which was heavily involved in the railway building boom of the time. As the west and east coasts were connected via extensive train lines, this was compounded by frailties in the global economic system, with Germany having demonetized silver in the aftermath of the unification of the country in 1871. Triggering a series of financial failures in European capitals such as Vienna. The resulting downturn led to an economic depression which would linger for the remainder of Grant's second term, creating financial hardship for many American citizens. The economic crisis was known at the time as the Great Depression, but this term was abandoned 70 years later when a much deeper economic crisis led to the period after the Wall Street crash of 1929 becoming known as the Great Depression. Accordingly, the economic crash and depression of 1873 to 1877 is today termed the Panic of 1873. On the foreign stage, Grant's policies were calm and pacifist. Despite his military background, he was no warmonger and deliberately tried to avoid conflict. However, he was also thoroughly inexperienced as a diplomat and left his foreign policy largely in the hands of the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. A number of issues confronted the US in the late 1860s. Firstly, the matter of reparations, and an apology from the British government for its supplying of naval support to the Confederacy during the Civil War remained unresolved. Several years of negotiations eventually resulted in the Treaty of Washington in 1871, whereby Britain acknowledged its role in building ships for the Confederacy and agreed to pay over $15 million in reparations. Thereafter, US-British relations improved steadily, and the two countries have been allies ever since. Just as pressing was the US's policy in the Caribbean, where a war, the 10 Years' War, had broken out between Cuban rebels and Spain in 1868. Despite occurring on its front door, the US maintained a policy of fairly strict neutrality in this, the first of 3 independence wars waged on the island of Cuba in the second half of the 19th century. More interventionist was the approach of the Grant administration to the island of Hispaniola. Then, as now, this was divided into 2 countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo. Grant was of the view that by acquiring control over Santo Domingo, the US could gain a strategic interest in the Caribbean, and also in the lucrative sugar trade of the region. In 1869, negotiations were opened with the government there to purchase the country, with US business interests acting as intermediaries. But after 18 months of wrangling over this, the scheme came to nothing, largely owing to the opposition from within Congress. The affair tarnished Grant's reputation to some extent, and is an indication of the creeping imperialist aspirations of the US in advance of the most aggressive period of American empire in the 1890s. Grant's approach towards the Native American people was enlightened by 19th century standards. He was a relatively benign assimilationist, believing that the Native American people should be treated fairly and enjoined to embrace the benefits of a Western education, economy, culture, and government. This might seem like a heavy-handed form of cultural intolerance by today's standards, but for a country which counted several presidencies in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, whose policies towards the Native American people had bordered on genocidal, Grant's approach was comparatively progressive. As a result, several peace treaties were negotiated with the Apache and Sioux ends of the Plains and Midwest during his first term in office, and conflict between the Native American people and the federal government was at an historic low. However, Grant's Native American policy could ultimately not escape the historical circumstances in which it was conceived. Try as he might to forge a new pathway, decades of conflict, oppression, and broken promises had created a thick air of animosity towards the US government amongst the Plains Indians. This was compounded in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. As prospectors streamed into the region, the Sioux Indians there, led by Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, prepared for conflict. The Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877 was a bitter end to Grant's presidency. Though famed for the victory, Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux Indians won over General George A. Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in late June 1876. The war ultimately ended in victory for the federal government. The administration of Rutherford B. Hayes, who had succeeded Grant by the time the war ended, imposed a harsh peace settlement whereby the lands of the Sioux were annexed and the Plains Indians of the region were forced into Indian reservations, a depressing end to Grant's enlightened Indian policy. In many other ways, Grant was ahead of his time. For instance, in 1875, he proposed a constitutional amendment to fundamentally weaken the ability of religious groups and churches to dominate the educational curriculum in a given state or region. Essentially, here he was calling for greater separation of church and state in a manner which was only beginning to be countenanced in the more liberal European countries. Equally, he was progressive in his advocacy for America's Jews, appointing dozens of Jewish Americans to federal office. Perhaps most unusual was his appointment of Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian as his Commissioner for Indian Affairs. Yet Grant's presidency was not without scandal either. During the 1872 election campaign, the press revealed that a number of prominent members of the Republican Party had been involved in siphoning profits from the Union Pacific Railroad Company through a shady corporate entity called Crédit Mobilier. Grant, who it must be said was scrupulously honest throughout his military and political career, was not implicated directly, but the fallout nevertheless damaged the Republicans, and by implication, his presidency. Worse followed in 1875 with the so-called Whiskey Ring Scandal. This had involved prominent federal officials and whiskey distillers defrauding the government out of tax revenues, facilitated by a widespread system of bribery. Again, Grant was not involved, but his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was, as was the Secretary of War, William Belknap. Resignations followed, but Grant again was damaged in the final 2 years of his presidency by the actions of others. The final act of Grant's presidency became one of the most controversial moments in the constitutional and electoral history of the United States, though Grant acquitted himself well throughout the course of it. With Grant having served 2 terms, the Republican Party had selected Rutherford B. Hayes to contest the 1876 presidential election against the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. The election was held on the 7th of November 1876. The result, when it came, was highly contentious. In the mid-1870s, there were 369 Electoral College votes. When the votes were counted, it was clear that Tilden had won 184 votes, one short of the 185 needed to be elected president. Hayes had certainly won 165 votes, but 20 votes were the subject of considerable dispute. These were the Electoral College votes for the states of Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. In the case of Oregon, the vote was contested as one of the electors for the state was found to be illegitimate, as he was an appointed official there, while in the other 3 states the vote was close enough that both parties claimed victory. The dispute dragged on into 1877. As it did, Grant, as the sitting president, came center stage. He instructed Congress to resolve the matter through legislative action and according to the electoral rules. He also refrained from mobilizing the army in the event of continuing disagreement, and on the 29th of January 1877, he formed an electoral commission to decide on the matter. This eventually resulted in what was to become known as the Compromise of 1877. Under its terms, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as the 19th President of the United States, a decision which was certainly fair, as the surviving evidence indicates that Hayes had actually won the 4 states in contention, though by less than 1,000 votes in the cases of both Florida and South Carolina. As such, Hayes would enter the White House with the smallest winning margin in the U.S. electoral history, winning the Electoral College vote by 185 votes to Tilden's 184 votes. But his victory came at a cost. In return for their acceptance of the result, the Democrats demanded that federal troops, which had been stationed across the former Confederacy states in the South since the end of the Civil War, should be removed from states such as Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. In the aftermath of their departure, the Democrats tightened their grip on the southern states, essentially rejecting Reconstruction and opting for a harsh imposition of Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised the free African American community in the South of the United States. Part of Grant's legacy has been tied up in his role in the Compromise of 1877 and the manner in which it allowed for the oppression of the African American communities of the southern states for decades to come. Yet Grant can hardly be held accountable for this. The southern states always seemed likely to set out on the path which they did in 1877, and Grant can hardly have prevented this in his final days in office. Conversely, at the time, he was widely praised for the manner in which he averted a constitutional crisis and renewed violence across the United States through his handling of the election crisis. Once the compromise was reached and Hayes eventually took up office in early March 1877, Grant was once again a private citizen. He was still just 54 years of age, a markedly young age for a man who had served an 8-year term and who had already lived such an eventful life up to that point. Given this, his later years might seem like something of an anticlimax, but they were not without their own considerable points of interest. First up was a world tour which he and Julia undertook. Over a 2.5-year period between the early summer of 1877 and the autumn of 1879, Europe was first on the itinerary, with the Grants travelling to England to meet with Queen Victoria before a long sojourn through continental Europe, in which audiences were had with Pope Leo XIII and the Chancellor of the newly established German Empire, Otto von Bismarck. Others whom they met with included Napoleon III of France and the celebrated German composer Richard Wagner. Further travel was then undertaken to the Holy Land and Egypt before returning to Europe and then heading onwards to Asia in 1879. The last leg of the world tour was the most interesting in many respects. While visiting Meiji, Japan, Grant became involved in efforts to establish a lasting peace between Japan and Qing China, during the course of which he got caught up in a conspiracy which aimed to assassinate both the Emperor Meiji and Grant himself. The Grants finally returned to the US, arriving in San Francisco in September 1879. During their long circumnavigation of the globe, Grant had received petitions from members of the Republican Party asking him to run again for the presidential office. In the 19th century, and for much of the 20th century, until the passage of the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution by Congress in 1947, there was no legal barrier to serving more than 2 terms in office. However, tradition dictated that no one typically should serve more than 2 terms, in line with a precedent which George Washington had established. Now, however, many believed that tradition should be ignored to bring Grant back for a 3rd term. Grant was not indisposed to the scheme, and so encouraged his supporters to put forward his name at the Republican National Convention, which met at Chicago in early June 1880. What followed was a chaotic convention. 3 main candidates, Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, were the candidates. Grant secured the most votes in the initial voting, but not enough to reach the 370 votes required for any candidate to be officially selected by the party. After dozens of subsequent votes, the impasse was finally broken when Blaine's supporters conceived of a scheme to nominate a compromise candidate in the shape of James Garfield, like Grant, a former Union general who had fought in the Civil War. Realizing he was beaten, Grant eventually threw his backing behind Garfield. The Republicans finally had a candidate, one who won the subsequent presidential election, but he did not last long in office, as Garfield was assassinated in September 1881, just months after his inauguration, becoming the second of 4 US presidents to have been killed in office. His vice president, Chester A. Arthur, succeeded Garfield and served until 1885. In the aftermath of his world tour and his failed presidential bid, Grant returned to the world of business. This was a time when US presidents did not receive a pension after leaving office, and Grant had never been an affluent man, nor had he ever been an astute businessman, and his post-presidential ventures proved no exception to this rule. Incredibly, the Grants had actually lost money on their world tour, where Grant could have capitalized on his renown to profit from it, and a venture into the railway sector in the early 1880s also proved unfruitful. Then, in 1883, Grant became involved in a Wall Street business venture which his son Buck had undertaken with Ferdinand Ward, a financier and a conman. In New York City, Ward was soon engaging in highly fraudulent activity involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in what was effectively a pyramid scheme. As a silent partner, Grant was almost certainly oblivious to what was happening, but Buck Grant was quite possibly privy to Ward's actions. In any event, Grant himself testified against Ward in court in 1885, shortly before his own death. And when the full details emerged, it actually elicited public sympathy for Grant, who had been swindled considerably by Ward. While all of this was unfolding in New York, the former president was working away at what became the only truly profitable business venture of his entire life. A renowned storyteller, Grant decided in the early 1880s to write his memoirs. His financial situation was inestimably aided by an offer by Mark Twain to publish the memoirs and guarantee Grant 70% of the royalties, an enormous percentage which was a clear act of charity on Twain's part. Eventually finished in the early summer of 1885, the memoirs have been well regarded ever since, with Grant depicting himself fairly and accurately by most standards. They became a bestseller, and Julia Grant was able to live a comfortable later life from the proceeds of royalties, which nearly reached $500,000 in sales, a huge sum for the late 19th century. Yet Grant would never live to see his memoirs published. In the summer of 1884, he had developed a throat problem, which was subsequently diagnosed in October as throat cancer. It advanced rapidly, and Grant would ultimately die from it on the 23rd of July, 1885, just days after finishing his memoirs, and at the relatively young age of 63. Over 1.5 million people attended Grant's funeral in a long 11-kilometer procession through New York City on the 8th of August 1885. In sharp contrast to later impressions of his presidency, Grant was eulogized at the time as being comparable to George Washington. He was buried in Riverside Park, but his body was later re-entombed at the purpose-built General Grant National Memorial in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, where it remains the largest burial tomb dedicated to an individual in the entirety of North America. During the 20th century, Ulysses S. Grant suffered from a poor reputation as one of the worst presidents of the United States, a belief repeatedly reaffirmed in polls and surveys. Views on him have changed to some extent in the last 20 years, but even so, this slightly more positive view of the 18th president has only seen him jump up the rankings to be considered about the 25th best or so of the 46 US presidents. Yet what the foregoing has sought to highlight is that this historical impression is largely unfair. To be sure, Grant had his flaws, but both as a military commander and as US president after the American Civil War, he accomplished much during a very tumultuous and difficult period in the history of the United States. Grant's military record speaks for itself to a large extent. Early on, he gained some attention for his service during the US-Mexican War, but thereafter, owing to a number of personal motives, he drifted away from military service. The outbreak of the American Civil War, though, in 1861, brought him back into the field. In the early years of that conflict, he distinguished himself well enough to become one of the Union's senior commanders, and no one was as prominent as him in the final reduction of the Confederacy in 1864 and 1865. Many scholars have pointed to the overwhelmingly superior resources which Grant had at his disposal against Robert E. Lee in these closing stages of the war, and suggest that he could not really lose given these advantages. But several other Union generals had previously been given the same resources as Grant had in the last year or so of the war, and yet they had failed to defeat the Confederates. Conversely, Grant did, and there is no doubting his significance to the annals of the American Civil War. His post-war record as president is less well regarded than it might be. As the 18th President of the United States, he guided the country through the arduous early period of reconstruction and economic stabilization in the aftermath of the war. He was successful enough that he was easily re-elected for a second term in the election of 1872. Moreover, Grant succeeded in reducing the power of groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, in the aftermath of the war to a significant degree. Certainly, the Klan rose to become a very troubling aspect of American life again in future decades, but this was not Grant's fault. Furthermore, while his policies towards the Native Americans of the Plains ultimately ended in war in the mid-1870s, Grant's approach towards the Indians was relatively progressive for its time, and the Sioux War was as much the product of decades of Western expansionism as it was anything Grant did during his term in office. Finally, his role in resolving the crisis which ensued from the presidential election of 1876 needs to be considered and appreciated. Thus, we are left with a man who has been largely unfairly denigrated by subsequent generations. Grant was something of a contrarian, and certainly a heavy drinker throughout his life, but ultimately he navigated many of the difficulties and challenges he encountered as well as he could. There are a great many of America's presidents who are generally more favorably regarded than Grant, who, if they had been placed in his shoes between 1869 and 1877, might not have kept the ship of state on such an even keel in the aftermath of the only civil war the country has ever experienced. That is to his credit. What do you think of Ulysses S. Grant? Should he be primarily remembered for his role as a general in the American Civil War? Or is his legacy as President of the United States one which has been unfairly dismissed and forgotten? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as John J. Pershing was born on the 13th of September, 1860, on his parents' farm near the small town of Laclede in Missouri. Pershing's father, John Fletcher Pershing, was born in 1834 and left his native Pennsylvania in the middle of the 19th century to seek his fortune along the Cumberland and Mississippi rivers, where he worked for several years piloting rafts of lumber down the river to the port at New Orleans. Pershing's mother was Anne Elizabeth Thompson from Tennessee. She hailed from a family of Virginians who moved west following the American Revolution. They married in 1859, while John was working as a foreman on the railroads. Soon after her marriage to John Fletcher Pershing, the pregnant Anne moved to Lynn County in northwest Missouri, where she gave birth to her first child, John Joseph Pershing. The couple would go on to have 8 more children, though only 5 would survive infancy. The Pershing family had its origins in the Alsace region, now part of France. But for centuries, this area had been a bone of contention between France and the German states. Pershing's great-grandfather, Frederick Pershing, was born under French rule and immigrated to America in 1749, settling in Pennsylvania and marrying a German wife. Over time, the family changed the spelling of the name to Pershing, without the F. The child was born 2 months before the presidential election on the 6th of November, 1860. After the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was elected president, the slaveholding states in the South feared that Lincoln would abolish slavery, and 11 of them would secede from the Union over the course of 7 months to form the Confederate States of America. The American Civil War would rage for the next 4 years as Lincoln sought to defeat the Confederacy. Although split between pro-Unionists in the North and pro-Confederates in the South, Pershing's home state of Missouri remained loyal to the Union, and John Fletcher Pershing traveled with the Union Army as a merchant, supplying the 18th Missouri Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Some of John Joseph Pershing's earliest memories as a child would have included news in July 1863 of General George Meade's victory over General Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and General Ulysses S. Grant's capture of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. These two battles collectively handed Union armies the initiative to conquer the South, but not before Pershing's hometown was raided by a band of pro-Southern guerrillas led by Captain Clifton Holtzclaw in June 1864. By September 1864, General William T. Sherman had captured the city of Atlanta, Georgia, in the heart of the Confederacy, and in April 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the war. While a young John Pershing was growing up in the post-war years, his father, John Fletcher, ran a general store and served as postmaster of Locklead, placing the Pershings among the most respectable families in the town. The boy went to the local district school and was consistently top of his class, and his parents hoped to send him to college to study for a career in law. John Fletcher had always been an enterprising man, and when land prices skyrocketed at the end of the 1860s and early 1870s, he joined in the frenzy of speculation. When the land bubble popped in 1873, the Pershing finances were ruined, and 14-year-old John Pershing's hopes of going to college along with them. The teenager would have to help out on the farm and the store in order to support his large family. At the age of 18, Pershing spent a year teaching African American children at Prairie Mound School. He saved up his teaching salary to study at the Kirksville Normal School for 2 years, where he graduated with a degree, allowing him to teach anywhere in the state. He then returned to Prairie Mound and continued to work on the family farm. The 21-year-old Pershing continued to have hopes of a legal career, but that changed upon hearing about a vacancy from his congressional district for a cadetship at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Although not particularly interested in a military career, Pershing took the chance to receive a free education of a much higher standard than his native Missouri, scoring the highest among a group of 17 in the local examinations. Within days, Pershing left for West Point to prepare for the national examinations, attending a prep school at nearby Highland Falls set up by Colonel Caleb Hughes, a former Confederate officer. After successfully becoming one of the 129 cadets admitted in the autumn of 1882, Pershing was elected class president during all 4 years at the academy. In between disciplines such as drilling, riding, and fencing, Pershing and his fellow cadets were often inspected by distinguished Union commanders who were graduates of the academy, including General Sherman, General Winfield Scott Hancock, and Grant himself, who was in his final years after serving 2 terms as president. When Grant's funeral train passed in West Point on its way to New York City in July 1885, Senior Cadet Captain Pershing led the salute. Pershing graduated from West Point in the summer of 1886, ranking 30th out of 77 in his class, and was commissioned a second lieutenant. By the time of his graduation, the Civil War was more than 20 years in the past, and there seemed little prospect of the United States being involved in any wars. Having been significantly reduced after the Civil War, what remained of the regular army was primarily stationed in the West, where occasionally they would see action against the Indian tribes, which had not submitted to the United States, though the Apache chief Geronimo would surrender in early September 1886. On the 30th of September, Pershing was assigned to Troop L of the 6th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, stationed at Fort Bayard, New Mexico. He saw occasional action, rounding up small groups of Apache, who held out despite their chief's surrender, and his success in doing so caught the attention of General Nelson A. Miles. In late 1890, the 6th Cavalry was sent north to South Dakota to take part in the final campaign against the Sioux Indians. With little left to do in terms of active service, in September 1891, the 31-year-old Pershing was appointed Professor of Military Science and Tactics and Commandant of the Cadet Corps at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Pershing would additionally serve as a mathematics instructor, and the university allowed him to take the law course as a student. During his 4 years at the university, Pershing trained the Cadet Corps at Nebraska so well that U.S. inspectors considered it the second best in the country, after West Point, further increasing Pershing's stature among War Department officials. Even so, promotion prospects were bleak in peacetime, and after receiving his law degree in 1893, Pershing was admitted to the bar in Nebraska. However, another economic depression that year prompted him to remain in uniform. After unsuccessfully applying for the captaincy in the quartermaster's department, in 1895 Pershing was promoted to first lieutenant and commanded a troop in the 10th Cavalry, a regiment of African-American troopers, at Fort Assiniboine in Montana. He led his troopers on a mission to round up 600 Cree Native Americans and return them to Canada. In early 1897, Pershing was appointed acting aide to General Miles, who was then serving as commanding general of the United States Army. When Miles sent him to New York to report on a military tournament, he sat in a box with New York Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, and the two shared their experiences of the West. The paths of the two men would cross again soon, but in autumn 1897, Pershing returned to West Point as an instructor in tactics. Such a position was not to Pershing's liking, especially as the United States was preparing for military intervention in Cuba in response to the heavy-handed approach of the Spanish authorities in suppressing revolts to its colonial rule. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 led President William McKinley to declare war. The 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment was being formed under the auspices of Colonel Leonard Wood and his deputy Theodore Roosevelt. After making an appeal to the Secretary of War, Pershing was ordered to rejoin the 10th Cavalry as its regimental quartermaster, and his association with the African-American troopers earned him the nickname Blackjack. The 10th Cavalry was part of the 5th Army Corps, being assembled in Tampa under the overall command of General William Shafter. After sailing to Cuba in June, Pershing fought alongside Roosevelt and his Rough Riders at Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill on the 1st of July 1898, where he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. Pershing's men would go on to besiege the port of Santiago de Cuba, whose surrender after 2 weeks encouraged the Spanish government to seek peace terms. Although the United States had defeated Spain in less than 4 months, the logistical and organizational problems in the Army caused a national scandal and prompted the resignation of Secretary of War Russell Alger, who was succeeded by New York lawyer Elihu Root. Following the war with Spain, the United States had also taken possession of the former Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, in addition to Cuba. Pershing was assigned to the Ordnance Department with the temporary rank of Major, establishing the Office of Customs and Insular Affairs to oversee the occupation of these newly acquired territories. After the outbreak of war between the Philippines and the United States in 1899, Pershing was dispatched as an adjutant in the islands of Mindanao and Jolo, home to large numbers of Muslim Moros who fiercely resisted American rule. After his promotion to captain in February 1901, Pershing took charge of efforts to pacify the Moros around Lake Llano by convincing the chieftains, or datus, that he and his men could be deadly in battle but fair in maintaining the peace. and he was recognized by them as the American Datu. His successes in establishing order caught the attention of Secretary of War Root, Governor William Howard Taft, and Theodore Roosevelt, now President of the United States. Secretary Root's reorganization of the War Department included the establishment of a general staff system, and Pershing was recalled to Washington in June 1903. In a message to Congress, President Roosevelt sought to introduce a system of promotion by merit rather than seniority, and singled out Captain Pershing as worthy of promotion to colonel in recognition for his success in the Philippines. Congress did not adopt the president's recommendations, and in 1904, Pershing was assigned to staff duty at the Southwestern Department at Oklahoma City, and later a student officer at the Army War College. During this period, the attention of military staffs around the world were drawn to Manchuria, where the Russian and Japanese empires fought over control of northeast China and the Korean peninsula. American public opinion sided with the Japanese underdog, which surprised observers by defeating the Russian army at Liaoyang in southern Manchuria and capturing the vital naval base of Port Arthur at the beginning of 1905. The armies and land battles of the Russo-Japanese War were by far the largest in history, and foreign observers were keen to learn about the application of modern weapons and tactics. In January 1905, Pershing was appointed military attaché to Japan and sailed there with his new wife Helen, the daughter of Republican Senator Francis Warren of Wyoming, who would give her husband 4 children over the course of their marriage. Pershing was attached to the 1st Japanese Army under the command of General Kuroki Temamoto. The attachés were allowed to observe general movements from troops from vantage points and received lectures from Japanese staff officers about the progress of the battle, but they were not permitted to accompany the soldiers as they attacked. Pershing had arrived at the front in March during the final stages of the Battle of Mukden, which saw the Japanese take control of southern Manchuria. In the meantime, the Japanese Navy defeated the Russian 2nd Pacific Fleet at the Straits of Tsushima at the end of May. Despite these successes, the Japanese military supplies and its government finances were running low, while large Russian armies remained on the field. Following mediation by President Roosevelt, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed in September 1905, ending the war. During these 6 months, despite the unsanitary conditions and unfamiliar climate, Pershing learned as much from the Japanese about modern warfare as he could. Following his service in Japan, Pershing was recommended for promotion to brigadier general by President Roosevelt. As his father-in-law, Senator Warren, served as chair of the Senate Military Affairs Committee, the nomination was easily approved. After receiving the promotion, he was sent back to the Philippines as the commander of the garrison of Fort McKinley. After 2 years, he was sent to Paris on a mission to report on the condition of the European armies. After his return to the United States, he returned to the General Staff, but was granted a 6-month leave of absence to restore his health, which had been affected by his service in the Philippines. By December 1909, he was back to full health and returned to the Philippines as the military governor of Moro Province, remaining faithful to his approach a decade earlier by governing the province with a combination of force and diplomacy. In order to deter suicide attacks by Moro insurgents, American troops adopted the practice of burying a dead pig with the bodies of Muslim attackers, though there is no evidence that Pershing personally gave these orders. In 1911, Pershing sought to disarm the Moros to maintain order and obtained the agreement of most Datus, though a minority resisted. In June 1913, Pershing defeated 800 Moros under Datu Emil at the Battle of Budbagsak, which effectively put an end to Moro resistance. After providing for the transition from military to civil authority in Moro Province, Pershing returned to the United States and in December 1913, he took command of the 8th Brigade, posted at the Presidio in San Francisco. In late April 1914, the brigade was sent to Fort Bliss in Texas in response to political tensions in Mexico. In February 1913, General Victoriano Huerta seized power in a coup. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States refused to recognize Huerta's government, and in April 1914, American soldiers occupied the port of Veracruz. Although protested by both Huerta and his domestic opponents, the American occupation was a factor in Huerta's decision to go into exile. After the constitutionalist Venustiano Carranza took power in his place, his former ally General Pancho Villa turned on the new government. Pershing had not expected to be in Texas for long and decided to leave his family behind in San Francisco, but the Mexican crisis was such that he was away from home for more than a year. While making arrangements to bring his family to Texas, Pershing received news that his wife and 3 daughters had died in a house fire, with his 6-year-old son Warren being the only survivor of the tragedy. The boy accompanied Pershing's sister Mary to Texas, while the devastated general continued to work hard, motivated by his devotion to duty and the desire to blunt the pain of his loss. Pershing's duty would soon come calling, when on the 9th of March 1916, Pancho Villa crossed the border into the town of Columbus in New Mexico, killing 18 American soldiers and civilians in the process. Villa had been defeated on several occasions by Carranza's government forces and hoped to draw the United States into a war with Mexico. Newly appointed Secretary of War Newton D. Baker appointed Pershing to command an expedition to pursue and capture Villa. In spite of these instructions, the Wilson administration was keen to avoid outright war with Mexico, and the capture and execution of Villa by the United States could further inflame tensions between the two countries. Leading a force which would grow to 10,000 men, Pershing pursued Villa deep into the Mexican territory, but further incursions were resisted by Carranza's government. For the next 11 months, Pershing's men would be 200 miles within Mexican territory, seeking to avoid war, but ready to defend itself against any army that confronted it. After the dispute was referred to a joint commission, Pershing's men were withdrawn in February 1917. By the time Pershing returned from Mexico, the First World War was well into its 3rd year. The war had broken out in August 1914 as the Allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia clashed with the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary and Germany on several fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Germans won significant victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in late August and early September, forcing the Russian army to abandon Poland in 1915. On the Western Front, the Germans invaded France and gained considerable territory, but failed in the attempt to encircle Paris. The German and the Anglo-French armies raced to the North Sea in an effort to outflank the other, but by the end of 1914, the Western Front was effectively stalemated. Despite a sustained German offensive at Verdun throughout most of 1916 and an Anglo-French offensive at the Somme in the second half of the year, the front remained largely unchanged. The Eastern Front was a more dynamic affair, and in the summer of 1916, a Russian offensive led by General Alexei Brusilov in Galicia and western Ukraine inflicted considerable damage on the Austro-Hungarian army, which had to be rescued by German troops. However, the Russians were unable to capitalize on the offensive, and heavy combat losses destabilized the home front, contributing to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II's autocratic government in the February Revolution of 1917. Although President Wilson proclaimed neutrality and was keen to stay out of the war, the United States was not a passive observer in the conflict. The British maritime blockade of Germany disrupted American trade, but orders for munitions from the Allies led to a boom in the American economy. German submarines attacked Allied merchant ships carrying food and munitions across the Atlantic. And although the Germans tended to avoid attacking American ships, American lives were occasionally lost on board British ships sunk by German torpedoes. The sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in May 1915, with the loss of almost 1,200 lives, including 128 Americans, caused outrage among the American public. While President Wilson continued to resist calls to go to war, he authorized increased spending in the Army and Navy to prepare for potential hostilities against Germany. The following May, after a torpedo attack on the steamship Sussex, the president scored a major diplomatic victory by forcing the Germans to agree not to target passenger ships nor to attack merchant vessels without warning. However, at the end of January 1917, Germany announced the renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare on the 1st of February. Less than a month later, Wilson was informed by the British of a telegram sent in January by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, proposing an alliance with Mexico, encouraging the Mexicans to reconquer Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas from the United States. By the time the president declared war on Germany on the 6th of April 1917, Pershing had succeeded the late Frederick Funston as commander of the Southern Department of San Antonio with the rank of Major General. On the 7th of May, Pershing was ordered to go to Washington and report to the Secretary of War. Responding to British and French requests for American troops, Wilson hoped to send a division to France, although Theodore Roosevelt proposed taking a volunteer force of 4 cavalry divisions to France. Wilson rejected him due to lack of military experience, and Senior Major General Leonard Wood was overlooked due to his friendship with Roosevelt and his criticism of the Wilson administration. Almost by default, Major General John J. Pershing was named commander of the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF. Although the Army did not have enough men to spare for a division, Wilson decided to send Pershing ahead with his staff and officers, while the men were trained in cantonments stateside before being shipped out to France. From an office in the War Department, Pershing set about recruiting the men who would accompany him to France. As his chief of staff, he appointed Major James G. Harbord, despite his close association with Wood, and the two worked together to assemble the small team of officers who would join them in France. The orders Pershing received from President Wilson gave him command of American forces in all Europe and stipulated that the identity of the American Army should be preserved. In other words, not to allow American units to be dispersed under French or British command. On the 28th of May, 1917, Pershing and his small group of fewer than 200 men sailed for France on the ocean liner RMS Baltic, escorted by 2 American destroyers. While on board, Pershing informed his future biographer Frederick Palmer, who was then attached to the AEF as a war correspondent, that he expected he would need an army of 1 million men in France. Pershing and his officers were greeted enthusiastically as they arrived in Liverpool and made their way to France via London. At Napoleon's tomb at the Church of Les Invalides in Paris, Pershing was presented with Napoleon's sword and raised it to his lips in a symbolic gesture. In the weeks before Pershing's arrival in France, a major Allied offensive planned by Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle was beaten back by German defenses on the Hindenburg Line. After thousands of French officers rose up in mutiny, Nivelle was sacked and replaced by General Philippe Pétain, the Lion of Verdun, who skillfully dealt with the mutiny by executing its ringleaders, while allowing most of the men leave to recuperate back at home. With the French army in no condition to launch an offensive, Pershing surveyed the other fronts and found little cause for optimism. A Russian offensive in June had collapsed within a month, and the Communist Bolshevik Party seemed destined to seize power at any moment. while the Italians struggled to hold their positions against the Austrians in the Alpine passes. The deadlock could only be broken by a large American army which did not yet exist. Its commander was confident that America's vast economic resources and manpower would make the difference, but warned his allies that it would take time. Pershing ensured that French war propagandists would not promise too much on behalf of the American war effort in order to retain his credibility. While the generals on the Western Front commanded hundreds of thousands of men, the largest contingent Pershing had ever commanded was the 10,000-strong force of the Pancho Villa expedition. The United States' experience of warfare on such a scale was purely theoretical, and even after the men of the American Expeditionary Force arrived in France in large numbers, they would still require further training. Pershing was confident enough that he could train his men behind the Anglo-French trench wall on the Western Front. He envisaged that he would train his army in French Lorraine, and once he had a sufficient army under him, he could target the salient at Saint-Mihiel, the fortress of Metz behind it, as well as the iron fields and railroad system that served as the line of supply communications for the German army in Belgium and Western France. After the first American contingent arrived at the end of June 1917, Pershing and his officers began to implement their training plan, drilling the men behind the lines before gradually introducing them to trench warfare. When the French suggested that the fresh American troops should be paraded through Paris on the 4th of July, Pershing agreed to send a battalion of the 16th Infantry Regiment. Starting from the Invalides, the parade arrived at the grave of the Marquis of Lafayette in the Picpus Cemetery, where Staff Officer Captain Charles Stanton made a speech on Pershing's behalf and announced, "Lafayette, we are here." After the festivities, Pershing's thoughts returned to how his army could help the Allies win the war, and in July he sent 2 messages to Secretary Baker requesting an army of at least 1 million men by May 1918, adding that he may require up to 3 million men in total. Even if the men could be recruited and equipped, they would have to be transported across the Atlantic, and Pershing emphasized the need for transport ships. With French industry at breaking point supplying the French and British armies, Pershing would need his own trucks and railroad locomotives, as well as hospitals, storehouses, and all other amenities required to sustain an independent American army. As if to emphasize the size of the military establishment he would take charge of, at the end of September, Pershing moved from his modest headquarters in a house on the banks of the Seine to an old French barrack at Chaumont in Lorraine. Pershing's aides included Colonel James Collins, who enjoyed a close relationship with the general dating from their service in Mexico, while Colonel Carl Boyd, a fluent French speaker, was crucial as an interpreter during meetings with French generals and politicians. In October 1917, Pershing was promoted to the rank of 4-star general. He ensured that his men were well disciplined, and his notorious attention to detail made his men as fearful of their commander's inspections as they were of the enemy. The stern discipline made for an efficient army, and when drilling his men, Pershing laid particular emphasis on the accuracy of rifle fire. Despite impatient calls by French generals and politicians for the Americans to take their positions in the trenches, Pershing preferred to wait, knowing that his men were not yet ready, and their mediocre performance in the heat of battle could dent Allied morale. Though by October, American units had begun to man quiet sections of the line in Lorraine, while both the French and the British hoped that American units would serve under their command, Pershing insisted on retaining independent command of his men to preserve their identity as instructed by the President. Pershing's stubbornness created tensions among the Allied generals who anticipated a major German offensive in the spring. In November 1917, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin overthrew the liberal provisional government of Alexander Kerensky in Russia with the promise of peace. In December 1917, peace negotiations between Russia and Germany were opened at Brest-Litovsk. This gave the German army the opportunity to redeploy 50 divisions to the Western Front in an attempt to break the Anglo-French defenses before the Americans could arrive in force. The small trickle of American troops that had arrived in France were not adequately supplied, but while Pershing wrote to the Secretary of War requesting provisions, he forbade his subordinates from sharing similar messages to politicians at home, fearing that it might undermine the home front. By the end of 1917, the United States already had 1 million men ready to go to France, along with large stocks of ammunition and supplies for the Allies. The only constraint was a shortage of ships to transport them across the Atlantic. In January 1918, as the British and French desperately requested American reinforcements, the British agreed to transport 6 American divisions to France to train with the British Army. By the time Secretary Baker visited France in March to inspect Pershing's troops, the AEF had 4 divisions of combat-ready troops, around 100,000 men in total. On the 21st of March, General Erich von Ludendorff launched the German Spring Offensive, with the first attack targeting the area around Saint-Quentin, at the junction of the French and British sectors. Within 3 days, General Hubert Gough's Fifth Army was in full retreat, but Pétain was slow coming to the aid of his British allies. The German breakthrough threatened to open a fatal breach in Allied lines, forcing the British to retreat their lines of communications on the North Sea, while the French would be obliged to defend Paris. On the 26th of March, General Ferdinand Foch was appointed to coordinate the Allied response to the Spring Offensive. The following day, Pershing arrived at Foch's headquarters and promised the French commander, "All we have are yours." And a week later, Pershing spoke in favor of giving Foch greater powers as Supreme Commander. Soon after the American 1st Division went into the trenches in the Picardy sector in April, Foch agreed to Pershing's offer to send 5 additional American divisions into the line, organized into its own Army Corps of 150,000 men in total. By the end of April, a second German attack aimed at driving the British to the sea was abandoned after fierce British resistance along the River Lys. On the 2nd of May, Pershing met with Foch, the Prime Ministers of Britain, France, and Italy, and British Minister of War, Lord Milner, at the Supreme War Council in Abbeville. With the Allies fearing the collapse of the front without American manpower, Pershing stood firm against demands from the other 5 men to replenish their ranks with American troops. In the end, the American general agreed that the first 120,000 American troops transported across the Atlantic in May would go to the British in return for the resolution that an American army should be formed as early as possible under its own commander and under its own flag. In order to boost Italian morale, Pershing also agreed to send a single regiment to the Italian front. As an increasing number of men in American uniform arrived on French shores, several of Pershing's staff officers were granted permission to take field commands. When Chief of Staff Harbord was given command of a Marine brigade in May, Pershing appointed as his successor Major General James McAndrew, who had served as the head of the General Staff College at Langres. By the end of May, there were 600,000 American soldiers in France, around half of whom were ready for frontline service. On the 28th of May, American troops participated in their first major battle as Major General Robert Bullard's 1st Division successfully captured the village of Cantigny. The success was overshadowed by a third offensive by 300,000 Germans against the Allied line between Soissons and Reims. Foch had anticipated that this part of the line would remain quiet and manned it with exhausted British and French troops. The Allied line broke, and by the 4th day, the Germans were on the banks of the Marne and closer to Paris than at any time since the beginning of the war. The Allies sent reinforcements to plug the gap, and Pershing dispatched the 2nd and 3rd Divisions to the reserve, defending the road to Paris. With the situation increasingly desperate, the British and French in the Supreme War Council now asked Pershing for 250,000 American soldiers a month. Blackjack remained insistent that the men should be adequately supplied, and eventually it was agreed that of the 250,000 men, 140,000 would be designated for combat duties, while the rest would be under Pershing's discretion to supply those at the front. By the time the Allies had come to this agreement, the U.S. 3rd Division mounted a valiant defense at Chateau Thierry, while the 2nd Division gradually gained ground as they contested German control of the Belleau Wood, eventually clearing the forest of Germans by the 26th of June. Germany's third offensive had been successfully blunted, and for the first time American soldiers had played a major part in the defense. A fourth German offensive on the Marne salient was defeated following a successful counterattack by General Charles Mangin at the head of 4 French divisions. Although Paris was now safe, Foch remained anxious and predicted that within a year the political will in Britain and France would be so exhausted that only the Americans could carry on the fight. He knew they would be vulnerable once their offensive energy was exhausted, and was keen to go on the offensive quickly. The Supreme Commander was therefore adamant that 100 American divisions be sent to France in order to end the war as soon as possible. Pershing and Foch signed a joint telegram to the War Department in Washington requesting 80 American divisions by April 1919 and the full 100 by July. Foch was ready for the 5th German offensive, launched on the 14th of July between Reims and Chateau Thierry. The 42nd and 3rd U.S. Divisions helped to render this final German offensive a complete failure. As he looked at the map on the wall of his office, Pershing saw that Germans had gained significant ground on the Marne salient, which the American commander called a balloon. Even before the 5th German offensive, Foch had developed a plan to prick this German balloon by attacking its exposed flanks. On the 18th of July, the 1st and 2nd American divisions attacked from the Retz Forest and advanced on Soissons, cutting off the main German supply route to the Marne salient and opening the way for the capture of Soissons on the 2nd of August. On the 21st of July, General Ludendorff called off the spring offensive, handing the initiative to Foch and the Allies. The German gamble to defeat the Anglo-French armies before Pershing could mobilize in force had failed. By July, Pershing had more than 1 million men under his command in France. It was no longer a question of if the Allies would win, but when, and most of the Allied commanders expected that victory in 1919. With the German spring offensive defeated, Pershing could return to his plans for an offensive in Lorraine. He was happy to leave General Hunter Liggett's 1st Corps, which consisted of the 1st and 2nd Divisions, as well as 4 others in the Marne sector, to join the French in closing the Marne salient. With 10,000 American soldiers arriving in France each day, American supply lines struggled to cope. In late July, Pershing recalled his former Chief of Staff General Harbord, fresh from his success as commander of the 2nd Division in Soissons, to take over the services of supply, and the two men inspected the whole organization together. At its headquarters in Tours, departmental chiefs asked for more horses, trucks, and guns. At Bordeaux, Pershing and Harbord met with black laborers from Mississippi who expressed their desire to go home. In order to motivate them, Harbord organized them into competitive teams, and the team with the best record would be allowed to go home first. Pershing would also see engineers assembling railroad locomotives and cars, engineering and artillery schools, storage depots, as well as the port of La Rochelle, from where the army received its coal and oil, and that of Brest, where most of the troops were landed. Pershing was not only commander of his army at the front, but the chief of a great enterprise, keeping that army well-fed, well-supplied, and well-treated. By the 6th of August, the Allies had successfully closed the Marne salient following the Second Battle of the Marne. during which the 85,000 Americans of First Corps suffered 12,000 casualties. For his part in developing and coordinating the offensive, General Foch was awarded the coveted Marshal's baton. A couple of days later, British and Canadian troops attacked the Germans at Amiens and advanced 7 miles in a single day. On the 9th, Pershing went to see Marshal Foch with a view that it was now time for his independent American army to attack the salient at Saint-Mihiel. After receiving the approval of both Foch and Pétain, Pershing recalled Liggett's First Corps and transferred it to his newly organized First Army in Lorraine. He then met General Douglas Haig, the British commander-in-chief, requesting the return of the American divisions in the British sector, now that the threat of the German offensive had passed. During his time at the British sector, Pershing was also knighted with the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath by King George V, who had been on a tour inspecting the British troops in France. The town of Saint-Mihiel was on the eastern bank of the Moselle River and formed the tip of a German salient, which Pershing had identified as the first stage of his plan to push into Metz and beyond into Germany. The American commander had over 500,000 men of his First Army at his disposal, in addition to some 100,000 French troops. 7 American divisions would attack the southern side, while another 2 would join the French in an attack across the river on the western side. By the end of August, Pershing was ready to launch his offensive, only to receive instructions from Foch to support existing British and French offensives that had proven far more successful than anticipated, forcing him to limit the Saint-Mihiel offensive. Pershing protested that this would destroy the independent character of the American army, and important time would be lost in moving the divisions in accordance with the new plan, especially as the American supply lines were now directed towards Saint-Mihiel. Pershing was nevertheless willing to move his American troops to another sector, provided he retained independent command. After receiving the support of Pétain, Pershing secured Foch's agreement on the original plan to attack Saint-Mihiel, while promising that he would have his men ready to support a French offensive against the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest on the 25th of September. On the night of the 11th of September, everything was ready for Pershing's men to attack at 5 o'clock the following morning. The main thrust would come from the south, relieving the pressure for the Franco-American assault on the west 3 hours later. The Germans had already begun to withdraw when the attack began, and Pershing could see that the troops were achieving their objectives ahead of time as they cut through the German barbed wire with ease. Back at battle headquarters, he called his corps and divisional commanders to speed up their objectives. By the morning of the 13th, the salient was closed when the 1st Division advancing from the southeast joined the 26th Division advancing from the west. The attack continued for another 2 days, by the end of which the American line extended to Houdeumont, 30 kilometers from Saint-Mihiel. Pershing's men had taken 16,000 prisoners and 450 enemy guns, recovering 200 square miles of territory. It was a spectacular triumph for the American Army's first offensive, which cost around 7,000 in killed and wounded. Pershing had initially anticipated attacking the fortress of Metz after taking Saint-Mihiel, but he had agreed with Foch and Pétain to turn his attention towards the Meuse-Argonne line, even though a frontal assault would be more costly than Pershing's proposed flank attack. In preparation for this new offensive, Pershing moved his headquarters to Silly, where a couple of years earlier, Pétain and Nivelle had commanded the French army during the defense of Verdun. Pershing's First Army was to be deployed in line from the Argonne Forest in the west to the heights of Verdun in the east. The German position in this sector was protected by deep fields of barbed wire in front of the first line, and they had prepared 3 more positions to withdraw to in the event of an attack. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would combine with the Anglo-French drive towards Saint-Quentin and Cambrai, which would see the Allies attacking along the whole length of the line. If Pershing and his men were successful, the Americans would threaten to cut off the Sedan-Mézières Railroad, which served as the main line of communications for the German army in western France. Within 11 days of the Saint-Mihiel offensive, Pershing's First Army of 600,000 men now had to be redeployed to take this new line. The movements were coordinated by Colonel George C. Marshall, Jr., the First Army's Assistant Chief of Staff. Pershing himself went back and forth to Corps and Divisional headquarters to ensure that all was in order. By the night of the 24th of September, all 9 divisions of the First Army were in place. Following a 3-hour artillery barrage, the attack began at 5:30 on the morning of the 26th of September. In the center, the 79th Division, which did not even have any trench experience, managed to capture the town of Montfaucon by the end of the second day. On the left, the poorly led 35th Division of National Guardsmen from Kansas and Missouri was badly mauled by the German defenders and lost half their men. The American line advanced up to 5 miles, though sustained German counterattacks forced some of the advanced units back to straighten the line, while Pershing arranged for a rotation of the divisions engaged in battle. The Allies were also making progress along other sectors of the line. With the German effort flagging, the German Chancellor resigned and was replaced by Prince Maximilian von Baden, who made an overture of peace to the Allies based on the 14 points that President Wilson had set out in January 1918. With the prospect of peace at hand, the French sought to restrict further American involvement in the war in order to limit American influence at the peace talks, while British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was keen to have American support of Britain's war aims. Pershing knew nothing of the talk of peace and continued to focus on fighting the battle, spending the majority of his time on his train, going back and forth visiting divisional and brigade headquarters to inspire and motivate his subordinates. He withdrew the 91st, 35th, 37th, and 79th Divisions and replaced them with the 1st, 3rd, and 32nd Divisions in reserve. On the 4th of October, the second attack was launched against the forbidding terrain of the Aire River and the Argonne Forest. The 1st Division managed to establish control of the heights over the east bank of the Aire. The advance of the 28th and 82nd Divisions relieved pressure on the 77th Division, which managed to press forward and regain contact with Major Charles Whittlesey's lost battalion that had been isolated within enemy lines for 6 days. In the center, the 4th, 80th, and 32nd Divisions found progress more difficult as they sought to capture the formidable Romaine Heights on the Hindenburg Line. On the right, the 33rd Division built bridges across the Meuse and managed to capture several German batteries, while the 29th Division followed up with successive attacks. After another brief respite, on the 14th of October, Pershing launched a series of assaults which captured the Romaine Heights. Pershing singled out the 33rd Division for capturing the strongest enemy positions on the Côtes d'Armor, while the 42nd Division's 84th Brigade, under the command of Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, seized the heights of the Côtes de Châtillon and took the machine gun positions in fierce hand-to-hand combat. By the 17th, the Americans were in control of the heights, and for the next couple of weeks, they had to defend against German counterattacks to regain the heights. But by the end of the month, the Americans had cleared the Argonne Forest of Germans. In the meantime, Pershing turned his attention back to Metz and organized a Second Army under the command of Major General Robert Bullard. Pershing then handed command of the First Army to General Liggett and remained in supreme command of both armies. Despite the American successes over unfavorable terrain during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Pershing's progress was not as significant as the Allied offenses further to the west. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was impatient at Pershing's slow progress. and on the 21st of October wrote a letter to Marshal Foch asking for Pershing to be removed as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, claiming that Pershing was deliberately preserving his men in order to sacrifice more French lives. Foch refused the demand, and the French premier could do no more. Meanwhile, on the political front, President Wilson had signaled his willingness to negotiate on the basis of the 14 points without consultation with Pershing. On the 25th of October, Pershing met with Foch, Pétain, and Haig to discuss armistice terms. Both Pershing and General Tasker Bliss, who had remained on the Supreme War Council after his retirement as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, had been in favor of unconditional surrender. On the question of an armistice, Pershing agreed with Pétain that the Germans should agree to Allied occupation of the east bank of the Rhine and Alsace-Lorraine, and in addition called for Germany to surrender its submarines to ensure the American army could return home safely. After Pershing transmitted these proposed terms to President Wilson, the president replied on the 30th that it would be enough to intern German submarines in neutral ports, and opposed American occupation of Alsace-Lorraine or the eastern bank of the Rhine. Wilson additionally asked Pershing to consult with his advisor, Edward House, who was now in Paris. Later on the 30th, Pershing wrote a letter to House in which he argued that giving the Germans an armistice might allow the Germans to fight another day. He concluded with his opinion that Germany should be forced into an unconditional surrender, but that any armistice should be sufficiently restrictive as to not allow the Germans to take up arms again. Pershing and his French allies had agreed to launch a general attack on the 1st of November. The fourth and final German line of the defenses on the Barricourt Heights remained a formidable obstacle, but after that it was an easy march down the heights to capture the railroad. The 89th and 2nd Divisions of 5th Corps in the center aimed to turn the west flank of the heights, with 2 more divisions in reserve, while the 5th and 90th Divisions of 3rd Corps would attack the east flank. The 80th, 77th, and 78th of 1st Corps protected the left flank of 5th Corps. With air and artillery support, the attack began at daybreak on the 1st of November, and by nightfall, the men had reached their objectives all along the line. On the back of the successes of the First Army, Pershing was given permission by Foch to advance the Second Army towards Metz. By the 9th of November, the First Army had scaled the heights and was racing down them in pursuit of the retreating Germans. An order went out in Pershing's name, ordering the First Army to take the honor of capturing Sedan, the site of the French decisive defeat in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. In the ensuing confusion, the U.S. 1st Division cut across MacArthur's 42nd Division in the race to Sedan, offending the sensibilities of the French. General Liggett agreed to withdraw and give the French Fourth Army the opportunity to recapture the town. With the capture of Sedan, the plan Pershing had conceived in 1917 had been fulfilled. Although an armistice was scheduled for 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, Pershing followed Foch's instructions and continued fighting until the clock struck 11, resulting in 3,500 American casualties on the morning of the final day of battle. Over 1 million Americans fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, of whom more than 120,000 were casualties. The German army, which had fewer than 500,000 men in the sector, suffered a similar number of casualties. In December 1918, President Woodrow Wilson arrived in France to participate in the Paris Peace Conference. On the day of his arrival in Paris, Pershing remarked, "He has been a good president to us, backed the army well, but he has his hands full now." Pershing knew that the task of making peace with the British, French, and Italians would be no easy task, and was happy to leave it to the president. Although the war was won, Pershing still remained in command of more than 2 million men. Of these, 240,000 men of General Joseph Dickman's Third Army served in the Allied occupation force on the eastern bank of the Rhine. The rest of the men would have to be transported back to the United States and demobilized, while their spare supplies could go towards reconstructing Europe after the wartime devastation. On the 14th of July, 1919, Pershing rode at the head of an American regiment in the Victory Parade under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. In September 1919, Congress recognized Pershing's service by promoting him to the rank of General of the Armies, specially created in his honor. He would become the highest-ranking general in American history until 1976, when President Gerald Ford posthumously elevated George Washington to the same rank, while ensuring that Washington would forever remain the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. military. In 2022, in honor of the 200th anniversary of his birth, General Ulysses Grant joined Washington and Pershing in that exalted rank. Following his return to Washington, Pershing was promised the salary of a four-star general for the rest of his life. Given the prestige and popularity he had gained as the victorious commander in the First World War, a group of admirers drafted him as a presidential candidate in 1920, though Pershing refused to campaign. His rival, General Leonard Wood, was an early frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination, but Warren Harding eventually prevailed. In 1921, Pershing was appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army, serving for 3 years until his mandatory retirement from active service at the age of 64. In 1919, the U.S. Army sent a convoy of the Motor Transport Corps across the United States from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to determine whether the country's road system was fit for purpose in case of a national emergency. By taking 2 months to make the journey, the convoy highlighted the poor state of repair of the road network. Accordingly, the Bureau of Public Roads requested from the U.S. Army a list of the most important roads in the United States in case of war. Drawing on his experience as commander of the AEF, when he had set up the supply lines for his army, Pershing coordinated the Army's efforts to create a map of the country's road network, highlighting the priority routes. After Pershing presented this map to Congress in 1922, it came to be known as the Pershing Map. The map led to major road-building projects in the 1920s, but work slowed down significantly following the Wall Street crash of 1929. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that President Eisenhower established the interstate highway system, based largely on Pershing's recommendations. Pershing took great interest in the commemoration of the men under his command who fell in the First World War. In November 1921, Pershing was in Kansas City for the groundbreaking dedication of the Liberty Memorial, where he once again met with Marshal Foch and other senior Allied war leaders. In the years following the war, many American units waiting to demobilize built their own monuments dotted around the European countryside in a haphazard, uncoordinated fashion. In March 1923, Congress established the American Battle Monuments Commission under Pershing's leadership to determine the design and location of official battle monuments. In addition to coordinating the construction of 13 battle monuments, the commission also organized efforts to gather the bodies of the fallen in 8 cemeteries on the sites of the main battlefields. Pershing would travel to France every summer to oversee construction work, and though Foch had died in 1929, Pétain still lived to welcome his old friend back to France. In 1937, all the World War I cemeteries and monuments were dedicated, including those at Belleau Wood, Chateau Thierry, Saint-Mihiel, and on the Romaine Heights at Meuse-Argonne. In 1931, Pershing published his memoirs in 2 volumes under the title My Experiences in the World War, which won the 1932 Pulitzer Prize. By the late 1930s, Pershing's health was in decline as he approached his 80th birthday, and he spent more of his time at the Walter Reed Military Hospital. After the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Pershing privately regretted that the Germans had not been forced to surrender unconditionally 20 years earlier. He was sure that the British and French would hold back the Germans as they had done in the First World War, and was shocked to hear of French resistance crumbling in the face of the German onslaught over 6 weeks from May to June 1940. He sympathized with his friend, Marshal Pétain, who at the age of 84 was appointed Prime Minister in order to sign a capitulation that retained as much French honor as possible. For the next 4 years, Pétain would serve as the Nazi German puppet of the Vichy regime. Following the fall of France, Pershing called for the United States to provide more military aid to the United Kingdom, and publicly supported the Destroyers for Bases agreement, whereby the Americans would supply the British with old destroyers in return for long-term leases on British naval and air bases. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 and the American entry into the Second World War, Pershing took an even greater interest in the course of the war. Pershing's mind turned back not only to his experiences in France, but those in Japan, Manchuria, and the Philippines. Pershing was pleased to learn that his son Francis Warren Pershing enlisted in the army as a private, who took part in the Normandy landings and fought all the way to the River Elbe, ending the war as a major. Although Commander-in-Chief Dwight D. Eisenhower had never served under Pershing, most of the U.S. Army's senior generals had done so during World War I. General George Marshall was now Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, coordinating the war effort from his desk in Washington. General Douglas MacArthur defeated the Japanese in the Philippines, while Pershing's former staff officer George Patton proved one of the most dynamic Army commanders of the war. In December 1944, Congress instituted the 5-star rank of General of the Army for the likes of Eisenhower, Marshall, and MacArthur, but Pershing continued to outrank them as General of the Armies. Pershing hoped to travel to Europe to salute the victorious American soldiers following the Nazi surrender on the 8th of May, 1945, but he suffered a stroke, which paralyzed the side of his body. In 1946, the 85-year-old Pershing married the 51-year-old French-Romanian artist Micheline Resco, with whom he had an affair in Paris in 1917, at a secret ceremony in his apartment at the Walter Reed Hospital. On the 15th of July, 1948, General of the Armies John Joseph Pershing died at the age of 87. He was given a state funeral organized by General George Marshall and buried among World War I veterans at Arlington National Cemetery at a site known as Pershing Hill. From his earliest days as a schoolteacher, John J. Pershing exhibited leadership abilities that would make him an effective military officer. Although he had never envisaged a military career and the prospects of promotion seemed bleak, Pershing remained in uniform and continued to catch the attention of civil and military officials in the War Department. After service in the Spanish-American War and taking part in the suppression of the Moro insurgency in the Philippines, Pershing was given the opportunity to learn as much as possible from the Japanese in the art of modern warfare, after which he was rewarded with a brigadier generalship by President Roosevelt. After spending another 6 years or so in the Philippines, General Pershing moved to the Mexican border. After a tragedy that claimed the lives of his wife and daughters, Pershing led 10,000 men in the Pancho Villa expedition, carefully balancing the political and military demands of the assignment. As commander of the American Expeditionary Force, Pershing was responsible for training and supplying an army which expanded from tens of thousands of men to 3 million. Although he was criticized by his allies for his insistence on ensuring that the men were as well trained and well supplied as possible, and on the maintenance of the independent character of the American army, he was pragmatic enough to place American divisions under French and British commanders to defend against the spring offensive. In the final months of the war, American successes at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne justified Pershing's approach in creating an independent American army in France. Pershing's extraordinary achievements received due recognition when Congress promoted him to General of the Armies. After playing a key role in the planning of the U.S. highway system and the construction of World War I memorials, Pershing lived long enough to follow the full course of the Second World War, fought by a generation of generals who served under his command. What do you think of John J. Pershing? Does he deserve his place alongside Washington and Grant as one of only 3 men to have been honored with the rank of General of the Armies? Or was he to blame for wasting American lives by launching a frontal attack at the Meuse-Argonne and continuing to fight until the hour of the armistice? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.